The valley had not seen rain in 14 months. The creek beds ran dry as old bone. The pastures cracked open in long, pale fissures, and the cattle stood in whatever shade they could find, heads low, too tired to move toward a trough that held nothing. A woman stood at the edge of her irrigation ditch in the early heat and looked at the place where water used to run. The channel was dust. The lock on the shared valve at the property line was new. Heavy steel. Someone had put it there recently, and deliberately, and the man who owned the land on the other side had already come by to name his price. She did not sell. 3 weeks later, her daughter knelt in the northeast corner of the pasture and pressed both palms flat against the earth. The ground was cool. Impossibly cool, and beneath it faint, almost nothing, something moved. The third morning without water, the cattle stopped walking to the trough. They simply stood in the shade of the old cottonwood line, at the far edge of the pasture, heads low, tails barely moving, not waiting anymore, just existing in the heat the way things exist when they have given up expecting better. Alma Rourke watched them from the edge of the dry irrigation ditch and felt something she had spent 4 years learning to suppress. The particular arithmetic of a woman counting what she had left against what she still owed, and finding the numbers would not balance no matter which direction she ran them. 200 acres. 26 head of cattle, down from 41 the year before. One promissory note at the First Territorial Bank of Harding, signed originally in her husband's name, now carrying her signature alongside his estate seal because the bank manager, Gerald Foss, had been decent enough to allow the transfer rather than call it due the month after Thomas died. 4 years ago. 4 years of her running this operation alone, and she had managed it. She had done more than manage it. She had kept every fence line, kept the herd numbers respectable, kept the vegetable rows her mother-in-law had planted along the south-facing slope, producing enough surplus to sell at the Harding General Store 3 seasons running, until 14 months ago, when the rain stopped coming in any serious way, and until 3 weeks ago when Clifton Aldred closed the valve. The irrigation channel that fed Rourke Hollow ran from a shared water source on Aldred's property, established by a handshake agreement between their grandfathers back when the valley was still being settled and men believed their word meant something permanent. Alma had never thought much about the fragility of that arrangement, because it had never needed to be thought about. The water came, the cattle drank, the fields got their allotment. That was the deal, and it had held for 50-some years across 2 generations of Rourkes and 2 generations of Aldreds without anyone writing it down, because writing it down would have implied they expected it to break. Then Clifton Aldred had his lawyer draft a letter about drought conservation requirements issued by the County Water Authority, and 2 days after the letter arrived by courier from Harding, a man she didn't recognize came out and padlocked the shared valve at the property line, with a lock that was not the old rusted one that had always been there. The new lock was heavy steel, bought recently, not left over from anything. That same week, Aldred came himself. He arrived in the Surrey with the black painted wheels that cost more than her best breeding bull had sold for 2 years ago, and he sat up on the driver's bench in a suit that had no business being within 40 miles of a working cattle operation. And he looked at her across the fence line the way men look at something they have already decided to acquire. His face was not unkind. That was the part that scraped at her worst. Clifton Aldred at 55 had the practiced pleasantness of a man who had learned long ago that visible menace was less effective than patient, smiling certainty. Drought is hard on everyone in this valley, he told her. County's asking us all to make sacrifices in terms of water usage. I've got obligations on my end that have to come first now. She looked at him and did not say anything, because the things she wanted to say would have given him satisfaction and the things she needed to say required information she didn't yet have. I want you to know I'm prepared to make you a fair offer for Rourke Hollow. He named a number. The number was not fair. It was the number a man names when he believes the other party has no alternative, dressed up in language designed to make it sound generous. Given the condition of things, it's more than the bank would give you if they foreclose in 8 months. 8 months. He had done the math on her loan, which meant he had access to information about her financial position that she had never given him. She held that realization in her chest like a hot coal and kept her face still. I'll think on it. Of course. He picked up the reins. Take the time you need. Though I'd point out that time is working against you here, not for you. He drove off. She stood at the fence line until the dust from his wheels settled back onto the cracked road, and then she walked back to the house and sat at the kitchen table for 1 full hour doing nothing at all, which was not a thing Alma Rourke did under ordinary circumstances. She was not a woman who sat. But she sat then, because she needed to understand the shape of what she was facing before she started moving. And moving in the wrong direction when you had limited resources was worse than standing still. The shape of it, as best she could trace it. Aldred wanted Rourke Hollow, and he had wanted it for long enough to have calculated the specific conditions under which she would have the least ability to refuse. He had not acted when Thomas was alive, because Thomas was known and liked in Harding Valley, and a direct move against the Rourkes then would have cost Aldred in community standing. He had not acted in the first 2 years after Thomas died, because Alma had proven herself capable enough that moving against her too soon would have looked like predation even to people inclined to look away. He had waited for a drought severe enough to put genuine financial strain on every small operation in the valley, and then he had moved, and he had moved in a way that left her with no obvious legal recourse because the water agreement had never been written down. That was what she was sitting with. The recognition that she was not dealing with opportunism. She was dealing with patience. Thomas would have put his fist through the table at that point. Alma looked at her hands on the scarred wood surface and decided she couldn't afford the table. The next morning she sold Thomas's second horse, the roan gelding with the good hocks that he'd been training as a cutting horse before the accident, to a buyer out of Pueblo who'd been interested for 2 years. She got $112 for it, which bought her another 4 weeks of hauled water from the county co-op and kept Gerald Foss at the bank from sending another letter for the time being. She started hauling water in a rented tank trailer, 40 minutes round trip twice a day, burning fuel she couldn't spare from the wagon team on roads that turned soft in the afternoon heat and added 20 minutes to every run. She rationed what she hauled between the cattle and the vegetable rows her mother-in-law had planted along the south slope, rows that Alma had maintained every season not because they were particularly profitable, but because letting them die felt like a different kind of defeat from the one Aldred was engineering. The community around her shifted in ways she recognized because she had watched communities shift before under the weight of powerful men with long memories. Old Pete Carvey, 2 properties east, had loaned her a water tank in the first week, wordlessly, setting it at her fence line before dawn one morning with no note attached. But by the second week, he had stopped returning her signals at the road crossing, and she understood without being told that Aldred had reminded him of something: a grazing lease, a favored arrangement at the county feed store, some thread of dependency that Carvey couldn't afford to cut. The hardware merchant in Harding extended her credit for a set of water pipe fittings without comment, but when she came back the following week, his wife was managing the counter and told her the credit account had been closed. No reason given. Aldred did not need to threaten people directly. He had been, with kindness. He had been in this valley long enough that people what his displeasure meant for their arrangements with him, and his arrangements touched enough of them that the math was simple. The cost of staying on good terms with Clifton Aldred was lower than the cost of helping Alma Rourke in any visible way. People made the calculation quietly and moved on with their lives, which was the rational thing to do, and which she did not blame them, for even as she felt the circle of available support contracting around her like a rope, Nessa noticed all of it. Nessa Rourke at 18 was not her father's kind of observant. Thomas had watched people, watched the social currents, tracked the emotional weather of a room. Nessa watched the land itself. She had done it since she was old enough to follow Alma into the pasture, cataloging the small changes in the ground and the vegetation and the behavior of animals, with a methodical attention that her school teacher in Harding had called a scientific temperament, which was a generism with kindness, which was the way of saying that Nessa cared more about what the earth was telling her than about the things other people thought she should be paying attention to. She kept a working journal, not a diary, not a record of feelings, but a record of observations. Which plants showed drought stress first and in what sequence? Where the remaining moisture in the soil concentrated after a dry period? Which corners of the property the cattle favored at different hours and why? She wore her working clothes, calico dress, boots, leather gloves when the fencing needed doing, and she moved through the ranch with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been its full co-operator for 2 years, because she had been. Alma had not had to ask. The morning after Thomas's funeral, Nessa had come downstairs before dawn, put on her boots and gone out to feed the cattle, and that had been the last morning Alma had done it alone. Now Nessa was spending part of every afternoon in the northeast corner of the pasture, near the old stone windmill foundation that Alma's great-grandfather Silas had built, and never finished. The structure sat as it always had, a half-completed ring of fitted stone that had served no obvious purpose in Alma's memory, and that Thomas had always said he'd figure out someday. Nessa crouched near the base of the foundation with her leather gloves off, pressing her bare palm flat against the soil. "What are you looking at?" Alma asked one evening when she came back from the second water run, and found Nessa still there in the long amber light, kneeling in the dust. "The ground is cooler here." Nessa pressed her hand down again to demonstrate, "Not just a little, significantly cooler. Feel it." Alma crouched and pressed her hand to the soil. The difference was real. In the brutal dry heat of that summer, with the earth baking from above and below, a patch of noticeably cool ground was an anomaly worth noting. But she had 100 more urgent things pulling at her concentration, and she filed it into the category of things she would think about when she had more capacity to think. Could be the stone foundation holding cold from overnight. Stone doesn't hold cold when the days are this hot. Nessa looked at her with the patient expression she used when she believed she was correct and was waiting for the other person to catch up. "I've been watching the cattle too. They come to this corner more than anywhere else on the property. They stand here longer. Some of them paw at the ground." Alma looked at the cattle dispersed across the far pasture. She could not immediately verify or disprove what Nessa was telling her. "Keep watching it. I've been watching it for 6 days. Nessa sat back on her heels. "I want 2 more before I tell you what I think. I don't want to get it wrong." That restraint, the refusal to name a conclusion before the evidence justified, it was so purely Nessa that Alma felt a complicated rush of tenderness and grief move through her chest. Thomas had been the opposite, quick to commit, quick to course correct. Nessa got her precision from somewhere else, from some combination of temperament and those years of watching the land answer back. 2 more days, Alma agreed, and went inside to start supper with the understanding that whatever Nessa was tracking, she would track it thoroughly. The fence on the north border needed mending. 3 posts had worked loose in the hard soil during the dry months, and a section of wire had sagged to the point where a motivated heifer could push through it without much effort. Alma had been putting it off because every morning brought more urgent demands on her time. But a fence breach meant potential cattle loss, and she could not afford that. So she loaded the post driver and the wire spool into the work wagon and drove the team up to the north line on Tuesday morning in early August, with the intention of spending most of the day on the repair. She found someone already there. He was working from the far side of the fence, his side. She would realize, replacing 2 of his own posts that had apparently suffered the same drought-loosening problem. He was a large man in a way that she registered, before she registered any other specific detail about him. Tall in a manner that made the fence posts he was handling look like kindling, with shoulders that suggested a frame built for significant physical work, rather than the sedentary years she would later learn he had mostly spent behind a desk. He wore a linen shirt that had been washed to the point of pale blue-gray, a vest of worn leather, denim trousers, and a Stetson hat with a crease she associated with men who'd had the same hat a long time. His boots were well maintained without being new. He did not look up when she drove the wagon alongside the fence line. He was setting a post with the focused attention of someone who intended to do the job correctly, and he finished not driving it before he straightened, removed his hat, and looked at her across the wire. Boone Hartwell. She knew him by name and by sight in the way that neighbors in a spread-out valley know each other well enough to recognize, not well enough to claim familiarity. He had bought the Lawson place 2 years ago, after it sat empty following old Carl Lawson's death, and he had been a quiet presence on that property ever since. She had heard he was former law, a county position of some kind, and that his wife had died. Beyond that, she had not tracked his particulars because she had not had reason to. "Posts are going in the north pasture too?" His voice was even and unhurried in the way of men who have spent time in rooms where the quality of their voice affected outcomes. "Same problem. Soil's too dry to hold the base." She looked at the work he'd already done, solid, properly aligned, the kind of work that would hold through the next wet season without needing to be redone. "I didn't realize you were having the same trouble. Most of the valley is." He put his hat back on and looked at the sagging section of her wire, then back at her. I can do that side after I finish here if you want. Won't take more than another 20 minutes. I can do my own fence, I know that. He said it without any adjustment in tone, without the small softening men sometimes added when they expected pushback, not conceding, not apologizing, just stating a fact. I offered because I'm already set up, and it's faster than you setting up separately. But it's your fence. She looked at him for a moment longer than she might have looked at most people in that situation. There was something in the directness of it that she hadn't encountered much recently. The uncomplicated statement of practical fact without any social maneuvering attached to it. Most of the people she dealt with currently were either trying to help her in ways that required her to perform gratitude she didn't have the energy for, or they were avoiding her in ways that required everyone to pretend they weren't. Boone Hartwell was doing neither. You know, Aldred approached you before he came to me, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Something in his expression shifted fractionally. Not surprise exactly, more like the acknowledgement that she'd gotten to it faster than he'd expected. He did. He wanted to buy the Larson place. He made an offer, yes, and you turned it down. I didn't buy it to sell it. He looked out across his pasture for a moment, and she could see him deciding how much to tell her, and determining that she had already worked out enough that withholding the rest was pointless. He told me he wanted it to expand the northern grazing range. That's a reasonable explanation. Except the Larson place doesn't adjoin his northern range. It adjoins yours. I looked at the property map before I bought it, and I looked at it again after Aldred made his offer and told me his reason for wanting it. The two things didn't line up. Alma took that in. The Larson property on her north side. Aldred's land to the east and south. If Aldred had acquired the north side as well, Rourke Hollow would have been surrounded on 3 borders, with the only access to the county road running through land owned or influenced by him. She had not worked that out entirely before this moment, and the working out of it now, standing at a fence line in the August heat with a man she barely knew who had apparently also worked it out, was a particular kind of cold clarity. He's been planning this for a while, she said. That's my read. Boone said it simply, without inflection designed to alarm her or comfort her. He picked up his post-driver. You want help with that wire section or not? The offer stands either way. She made a decision about him in that moment that she would not have been able to fully articulate a decision based on the specific quality of his directness and the specific detail of what he had just told her, which was information that did not benefit him to share, but which she needed. She told him she would take the help. They worked the north fence line for the next hour and a half without talking much, which suited them both. That evening, she sat on the front porch after supper, watching the light drop behind the ridge to the west, and ran through the arithmetic again. What she had, what she owed, what she had left to sell that would not compromise her core operation. The horse was gone. She had 2 items of Thomas's that had value: a pocket watch his father had brought from somewhere east, and a rifle that was well made enough to fetch something from the right buyer. She was not ready to sell either of those yet. She was running out of things she wasn't ready to part with, and Aldred would keep waiting. That was the structure of the thing. He had time and she did not, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and the gap between what she could hold out for and what he needed to wait for was shrinking in a direction that only benefited him. She had to find something he hadn't accounted for. The problem was that she didn't know yet what that might be. 2 evenings later, Nessa came to find her in the barn where Alma was doing the inventory on the remaining feed supply, running her hand along the stacks and doing unhappy math. I need to show you something. Nessa had her working gloves tucked into her belt and a smear of dirt on her cheek that she hadn't bothered to wipe off. Now, while there's still light, they walked together across the pasture toward the northeast corner, toward the old windmill foundation. The cattle were there, not all of them, but a significant portion, clustered near the stone base with their heads low and their noses close to the ground at the base of the foundation. They were not pawing at it, not distressed. They were attentive in the way animals are attentive to something they can sense that hasn't yet resolved into something they can act on. Nessa crouched and put both hands flat on the ground just inside the arc of the stone foundation. Here. She moved her hands to indicate a specific area, and here. And there's something else. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small length of moss, fresh, still slightly damp, impossibly green in the parched landscape. I found this growing at the base of one of the foundation stones, on the inner face where it doesn't get direct sun. Moss needs consistent moisture to survive. Not a lot, but consistent. Alma looked at the moss in her daughter's palm. It was not large, a patch the size of her thumb, but it was alive, and everything else in the northeast corner of Rourke Hollow had been brown for months. And last night, Nessa continued, I was out here just before full dark. I heard something. She stood and looked at Alma directly. I know how that sounds. I know you've heard enough things that turned out to be nothing this summer. But I heard something moving under the ground near these stones. Not loud, not running, just moving. The way water moves when it's looking for a way up. Alma stood in the fading amber light and looked at the stone foundation that she had walked past 100 times without thinking about it as anything other than her great-grandfather's unfinished project. Silas Rourke had built it. He had set the stones with care. She could see that in the fitting of them even now, generations later. She had always assumed he'd meant to put up a working windmill and run out of time or resources before he finished. But a man building a windmill did not typically fit the base stones with that precision. A man building something meant to hold a specific structure above a specific piece of ground did that. She crouched down and pressed both hands flat against the earth inside the stone arc. The coolness was immediate and unmistakable, not the mild variation she might have attributed to shade or stone, but a genuine temperature differential that had no business existing in ground that had been baking under Colorado sun for 14 months. And then she heard it. Just for a moment. A faint, almost nothing movement beneath the surface. Gone the instant she held her breath to listen, harder but real. Not her imagination. Not wishful thinking. Something down there, moving in the dark under the stone. She looked up at Nessa. Nessa looked back at her with the expression of a woman who has been patient for 2 days, and is now quietly certain. I think Silas knew something was here, Nessa said. I think that's why he built here and not somewhere else. Alma stood. She looked at the foundation stones and at the moss, and at the cattle standing nearby with their patient, inexhaustible animal attention, and she made a decision that she suspected was either going to change everything or add one more entry to the list of disappointments that season had taught her to absorb. Get the shovel, she said. They dug in the last of the evening light, Alma working the long-handled shovel while Nessa used the smaller one and her gloved hands to clear the loosened soil. The ground resisted for the first foot, hard-packed and dry, the shovel ringing dully off compacted earth with each strike. Alma's arms burned. The light dropped degree by degree toward the cool purple of a Colorado evening. Nessa did not suggest stopping. The change started so gradually that Alma almost missed it. The soil color first shifting from the pale tan of drought-dried ground towards something darker, not wet yet but holding more moisture than the surface layers. Then the texture changed under the blade of the shovel, no longer powdery and resistant, but yielding, pulling away in chunks that held their shape when she lifted them. Then the smell. Wet earth. Not the thin, vaguely metallic hint of moisture that sometimes rose from deep soil after a particularly dry period, but the actual smell of genuinely wet ground, organic and full and rich, the smell of a world that still had water in it. Alma stopped with the shovel blade in the hole and just breathed it. Mom, Nessa's voice was barely above a whisper. At the base of the excavation, catching the last slant of evening light at an angle that made it visible, was a single point of moisture beating against the face of an old stone, not the surface stones of the foundation, but a buried stone that had clearly been placed there intentionally, part of a structure that existed below the visible foundation. The stone was fitted. It had a mortar line along one edge, crumbling with age but still partly coherent. Whoever had built the visible foundation had built something beneath it as well, something deliberately sealed and left. Nessa reached past Alma and worked her gloved fingers along the edge of the buried stone. There's a gap on the right side. The mortar's broken out here. She pulled at the edge carefully, and the stone shifted not much, perhaps an inch, but enough for both of them to hear a sound that had no precedent in the months that had preceded it. Water, moving, right below them. Not a rush, not a flood, a steady, quiet, persistent trickle of water moving through a space that had been sealed for long enough that no one living had heard it. It found the gap they had made, and it began slowly to seep through, collecting in the depression they had carved in the bottom of the hole. Dark and cold and real. Neither of them spoke. Nessa sat back on her heels with her gloves in her lap and looked at the small pool collecting in the excavated earth, maybe a cup of water, maybe 2. But growing steadily, fed by something beneath that was not going to stop because they looked at it. Alma set the shovel down in the dirt beside her and stayed exactly where she was, kneeling in the hole, watching water find its way up into a world that had been trying to convince her it had run dry. "Mom," Nessa said again, softer, "is this ours?" Alma looked at the water pooling in the base of the hole they had dug in the ground of Rourke Hollow, land that had been in her family since her great-grandfather Silas had chosen it and built on it, and apparently known enough about it to mark what lay underneath, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not joy exactly, she was too cautious for joy, too aware of how many questions this discovery immediately raised, but something that occupied the same region of the chest. The possibility that the ground beneath her was not exhausted, that what looked like the end of something might have a different shape entirely, and right alongside it, quieter and more careful. Clifton Aldred does not know about this yet, and whoever she told or showed would determine how long that remained true. Because in Harding Valley, information moved the way water moved on a slope along the lines of least distance, toward whoever stood at the bottom of the hill with the most purchase. She needed to understand what she had before she let anyone outside this pasture know she had it. "It's ours," she said, "but we're going to have to prove it." The next morning she was in Harding before the storefronts had fully opened, riding the bay mare that she'd kept from the sold horses, because the mare was older and less valuable at sale, but still sound and steady. She tied up at the rail beside the small white house on the eastern edge of town that had a sign above the door reading R. Colby, retired. Ruth Colby had been the clerk of the County Land Records Office for nearly 30 years before she retired, and in that time she had personally recorded or reviewed virtually every property transaction, survey result, and water rights filing in Harding Valley. She kept meticulous personal records because she had never fully trusted the county's filing system. A suspicion that 30 years of watching things get misfiled or go missing had more than vindicated. Alma knocked. Ruth Colby opened the door in her house dress and looked at Alma with the expression of a woman who recognized a person arriving with serious purpose at an early hour. She was 69, small-framed, with white hair pinned back severely and eyes that missed nothing. She stepped back from the door without asking what Alma needed, which Alma took as an indication that Ruth Colby had been waiting in some sense for exactly this kind of visit. "Sit down," Ruth said, going to the large cabinet along the south wall that took up most of the room. "Tell me what you need. Everything you have on Rourke Hollow going back to when Silas filed the original claim, and anything that involves the shared water arrangement with the Aldred property." Alma sat in the chair by the window. "And if you know anything about a water assessment that was filed in the county records around 1880 or 1890, I need to know about that too." Ruth pulled open a drawer and started going through it with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was. "I know the name Rourke. I know the name Aldred even better. And yes, there was a water assessment in 1889. I remember it specifically because the man who filed it for county storage asked me to categorize it under internal administrative documents rather than public land and water records." She turned and looked at Alma over her shoulder. "I found that unusual. I made a note of it. I kept a copy." Alma's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. "Who asked you to file it that way?" Ruth Colby set a folder on the table between them, then a second one, then a third. She sat down across from Alma and folded her hands on top of the folders in a manner that suggested she was not going to rush. "That," she said, "is exactly the right question. And I have had 30 years to be annoyed that no one asked it until now." She opened the first folder, the original survey, commissioned in 1863 by Silas Rourke, Alma's great-grandfather. The document was age-browned at the edges and written in the careful copperplate of a professional surveyor, and it was complete and specific in a way that formal surveying documents of that period often were not. It recorded not just the boundary lines of the property but the natural features within those boundaries, and among those features, listed in the property description under the heading Natural Water Resources, was a notation about a spring source and accompanying spring house structure, located at the northeast boundary near the stone windmill foundation, falling entirely within the Rourke Hollow property line. The surveyor had recorded it. He had signed it. 3 witnesses had signed below him. Alma read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and waited for Ruth to continue. The second folder held the water assessment from 1889, the one that had been misfiled. The document was technical, written by a man who identified himself as a land and water surveyor, working under contract to the county, and it described in methodical language the underground water system beneath the valley. The relevant section, which Alma read slowly and then read again, described the aquifer beneath Rourke Hollow as a contained pocket, geologically distinct, separated from the larger water system to the east and south by a formation of grey stone that acted as a natural barrier. The assessment's conclusion was that the Rourke Hollow water source was independent, not part of the shared channel system, not connected to the Aldred property's water, entirely separate, filed under internal administrative documents, hidden in plain sight for 35 years. Who asked you to file it that way? Alma asked again. Ruth looked at her steadily. The request came through Clifton Aldred's lawyer at the time. I was told it was to prevent unnecessary disputes over water rights during a period when the county was trying to settle other claims. She paused. I was young enough then to take that explanation at face value. I have spent a great deal of time since then not taking things at face value. Outside the window, the town of Harding was beginning to move, a wagon rolling past, voices from the direction of the feed store, the ordinary sounds of a summer morning in a small valley community going about its business. Alma sat with two documents in front of her that between them established two things she would need. The spring on Rourke Hollow land had been surveyed and recorded as belonging to that land in 1863, and the underground water feeding that spring was geologically independent of anything Aldred could claim a shared interest in. That was two pieces. She needed to understand if there were more. And she needed to understand one other thing that had been sitting at the edge of her mind since the water assessment date, registered 1889, 35 years after the original survey, 35 years after Silas had built his spring house and his foundation stones and sealed the spring beneath it for reasons she was only now beginning to understand. Why had someone ordered a water assessment of that specific location in 1889? What had prompted the inquiry, and why had the results of that inquiry been deliberately kept from public record? She looked at the third folder, still closed in front of Ruth. What's in that one? Ruth's expression did not change. That one took me longer to find. I almost didn't keep it. Because it wasn't county business, it came through my office as a misfiled piece of correspondence, addressed to the wrong party, left in our incoming documents by mistake. I should have returned it or discarded it. A small pause. I kept it. I'm not entirely certain why, professional habit, perhaps, or the fact that the name on the address struck me as worth noting. She opened the third folder and set the top document on the table. It was a letter. The date at the top was 1879. Earlier than the water assessment, earlier than anything Alma had been looking for. The letter was from a land and water survey company. The name of the company was printed at the top, in the formal letterhead style of the period, and it was addressed to Clifton Aldred at Aldred Cattle Company, Harding Valley, Colorado. Alma read it. The letter was a preliminary survey report, the kind a thorough man commissioned before he made decisions about property in a region. It described the water potential of the land along the Red Tail Ridge watershed, and it mentioned, in language that was almost but not quite offhand, an unregistered spring source on the neighboring Rourke property. Location consistent with the northeast boundary, consistent with earlier records suggesting a sealed spring structure. The letter noted the source as dormant or capped, currently unused, and recommended it be monitored for future development potential. 1879, 8 years before Alma found the water. Clifton Aldred had known about the possibility of a spring on Rourke Hollow land since 1879. When he commissioned a survey of the watershed and the survey had found the traces of it. He had known, and he had filed a county water assessment 10 years later to get official confirmation of what he suspected, and then he had arranged for that assessment to disappear into this filing category, where it would not be seen by the people who most needed to see it. He had not moved immediately. He had watched. He had waited through Thomas's years running the ranch and through the early years of Alma running it after Thomas died, and he had watched the drought develop across the valley and understood what it meant, and when the conditions were right, he had closed the valve and come to her fence line, and named his number with that calm and patient pleasantness, because he had to treat them with kindness, because he had been carrying the knowledge that her land held something valuable for 8 years, and had designed this entire sequence to bring her to a point where she would give it up without understanding what she was giving. She sat for a long moment looking at the letter. Outside, the ordinary sounds of Harding continued, entirely unchanged. The world did not rearrange itself to mark what she had just learned. He knew, she said. Not for Ruth's benefit, just to hear it in her own voice, in the open air, outside of her own head. It appears so, Ruth said. Alma stacked the 3 documents back in their respective folders with careful hands and looked at Ruth Colby across the table. Ruth, who had kept an improperly filed letter for 35 years, because something in her professional instinct told her it mattered. Ruth, who had recognized Alma's urgency at her door this morning, and had pulled the folders without being asked to elaborate. "I'm going to need these at a county water board hearing," Alma said. "Will you stand behind them?" Ruth Colby had the expression of a woman who has been waiting a very long time to be asked a specific question and is not going to perform any uncertainty about her answer. "I have been behind them since 1889, she said. "I simply needed someone to come and stand in front of them with me." Alma rode back to Rourke Hollow in the full heat of the morning, with the 3 folders wrapped in her saddlebag and the shape of what she was going to do becoming clearer with every mile the bay mare put behind her. She was not done building the case. There was a 4th piece she suspected existed, something that connected the closed valve not to drought emergency but to deliberate strategy, and she did not have it yet. But she had enough to know the shape of the hole, and she had it before Aldred knew she was looking. She came up the drive and saw Boone Hartwell's horse tied at her fence rail, and she saw Boone himself sitting on the top rail with his hat pushed back and his long frame folded in on itself, in the patient posture of a man prepared to wait as long as required. He watched her come up without speaking until she was close enough that speaking didn't require raising his voice. "You left early," he said. "I had something to do." He looked at the saddlebag, then back at her face, and appeared to read whatever he found there with the same quiet efficiency with which he did most things. "You found something." "I found several things." She dismounted and tied the mare alongside his horse. She looked at him across the rail, at this large, quiet man who had told her about Aldred's approach on his property without being asked, who had mended fence on her side without making it into something she owed him for, who had sat down in her kitchen 2 evenings ago and gone through 30 years of county documents with her until midnight, without once suggesting she might want to let it go or consider Aldred's offer more carefully. She made a decision about how much to trust him, the kind of decision that cannot be made slowly when time is not on your side. "Come inside," she said. "I need another set of eyes on what I brought back, and I need to tell you what I think we're missing and how to find it." Nessa was in the kitchen when they came in, sitting at the table with her observation journal open and a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked at the saddlebag and then at Alma's face, and did not need to ask whether it was good or bad. She just got up and put another cup of coffee on the table for Boone without being told to, and went back to her seat and opened the journal to a fresh page. Alma spread the 3 folders on the kitchen table in the afternoon light. "Here's what we have," she said, "and here's what we still need." The 3 folders sat open on the kitchen table like a verdict. Boone pulled the chair across from Alma's and sat in it, the way large men sit in small chairs carefully, as though he was always conscious of the space he occupied relative to the furniture around him. He read the 1863 survey. First slowly, the way a man reads a legal document, when he understands that the specific language of it is going to matter. Then the 1889 water assessment. Then the 1879 letter addressed to Clifton Aldred. He set each one down in sequence, face up, spread across the table so all 3 were visible at the same time. He looked at them together for a long moment, the way you look at a pattern once you've identified all its components and you're checking whether you've read it correctly. 8 years, he said, at minimum. Alma had her hands around her coffee cup, not drinking from it, just holding it. The 1879 letter is the earliest record I've found. There may be something older. There may not need to be. Boone leaned back and crossed his arms, and the chair registered his weight, with a faint creak of protest that neither of them acknowledged. 3 documents from 3 different points in time, each independently corroborating the same essential facts. That's not nothing, Alma. That's a foundation. It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed it and set the noticing aside. It's enough to tell the story. It may not be enough to win a county water board hearing against a man who has relationships with half the people who sit on that board. No, he said it without hesitation. It's not. Not by itself. You need something that directly connects the valve closure to his intentions rather than to drought emergency protocol. Without that, he'll argue the 1,879 letter is historical curiosity. The 1,889 assessment is an administrative filing issue he had nothing to do with, and everything else is coincidence assembled by a woman who's looking for someone to blame for her water problems. He looked at her across the table. That's how his lawyer will frame it. I've watched that particular argument get made in county proceedings more times than I'd like to remember. Nessa was writing something in her journal at the far end of the table. She had been doing it the entire time, tracking the conversation the way she tracked everything, not interrupting, not inserting herself, just recording. When she looked up, it was with the expression she wore when she had arrived at a conclusion she was deciding whether to name out loud. The valve was closed before the county conservation order went into effect. Both Alma and Boone looked at her. I checked the date on the county order. Nessa turned the journal around so they could see the page, a timeline she had drawn in her careful, methodical hand, dates marked at intervals, a specific notation circled twice. The county issued the water conservation order for drought emergency on July 9th. I asked Mr. Fenwick at the post office when the order came through because he processes official county correspondence and he remembers dates better than most people. She tapped the circle on the page. The valve on our irrigation channel was closed on June 17th, 3 weeks before the county order that Aldred used to justify it. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a room where nothing is happening, the quiet of a room where something has just shifted. Alma looked at the circled date, June 17th. She knew that date the way she knew the date Thomas had died, and the date the bank had transferred the loan into her name, with the specific texture of a day that had altered the shape of everything that came after it. She had noticed the water drop in her lower pasture irrigation line on the morning of June 18th, a Tuesday, when she walked the ditch and found it dry 2 hours into the morning and couldn't account for why. She had assumed an equipment problem. She had walked the full length of the ditch before she found the valve locked with the new steel padlock. He closed it 3 weeks early, she said. Not for information. Because saying it out loud made the thing complete in a way that thinking it only approximated. Boone was already looking at the timeline Nessa had drawn. The conservation order gave him the excuse, but he needed the head start. 3 weeks of water stress before he could use official policy as cover that's calculated. He paused. And the person who physically closed that valve and installed that lock can speak to when and why they did it, if they're willing to. Sadie Pruitt's father worked maintenance for Aldred Cattle Company for years, Alma said. He died 2 winters ago. But Sadie was at the well inspection last week as the surveyor's assistant, and she mentioned something in passing. She said her father always told her the equipment on Aldred's irrigation system was kept in better condition than most operations his size. Which means he knew his people, and his people knew his orders. Sadie Pruitt is Albert Pruitt's daughter, the one who runs the dry goods in Harding now. Boone said it as a piece of information being confirmed, not a question. Her cousin works out at Aldred's operation, Nessa said without looking up from the journal. Does the grass cutting and the perimeter work? She mentioned him when she came out to the well inspection. Alma set her coffee cup down. She had not known about the cousin. Nessa collected these details the way the ground collected moisture without announcing it, simply by being attentive and present when information passed nearby, which meant that Sadie Pruitt, whose father had worked for Aldred and who was now herself in a position to know things about how that operation functioned, had a family member currently employed at Aldred Cattle Company. That was a complication in one direction and possibly a resource in another, depending on where Sadie Pruitt's loyalties sat and how much her father had told her. She's the fourth piece, Alma said quietly. If her father told her anything, and if she's willing to say it, you can't know that until you ask her. Boone's voice was level. And you can't ask her until you understand what you're asking her to risk. Aldred can make life difficult for people in this valley in ways that don't require direct threats. Her cousin's employment, her credit at the feed store, whether her dry goods account at the freight company gets prioritized or put at the back of the shipment schedule. I know what he can do. Alma did know. She had been watching him do it to the community around her for weeks. The question is whether what her father knew is enough to matter, and whether she believes it matters enough to say it. They left it there for the night, because there was no faster way to answer that question than to find Sadie Pruitt and have the conversation, and it was already past the hour when a woman could call on another woman in Harding without it becoming a piece of valley gossip that reached the wrong ears before morning. Alma walked Boone out to his horse at the rail and stood in the dark Colorado night while he checked the saddle cinch with the automatic habit of a man who trusted horses more than he trusted most other things. The stars were the kind of sharp that only happened at altitude in August, before the heat of summer broke, but after the dust had settled from the afternoon winds. They had the particular quality of a sky that looked close enough to read. Alma had grown up under that sky and had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the furniture in your own house. But she noticed it now for reasons she could not have explained clearly if she'd tried. "You knew he'd approached you on the property before you told me," she said. "You told me almost immediately. You didn't have to." Boone had his hand on the saddle horn and was looking at something across the dark pasture. "No. Why did you?" He turned and looked at her, and there was a long enough pause before he answered that she understood he was not going to give her the easy version. "Because I sat on information once when sitting on it felt like the right professional judgment, and something bad happened that might not have happened if I'd acted on what I knew sooner." He took the reins. "I decided I wasn't going to make that particular mistake twice." She did not ask what the bad thing was. It was not the time for that story, and she suspected he already knew it wasn't, and that the telling of it would happen when there was room for it or not at all. And either way, the decision it had produced in him was already doing its work in the present moment. He rode back across the north pasture toward the Hartwell place. She went inside and found Nessa had gone to bed, the lamp on the kitchen table turned low. The 3 folders were stacked in a neat pile, with a flat stone from the garden set on top to keep them together. Nessa's small, precise handwriting on a piece of paper tucked under the stone. "Check the moss again in the morning. I think the flow is increasing." Alma blew out the lamp and went to bed knowing she would not sleep well. She did not. She lay in the dark and ran through the sequence of what she had and what she needed and what Clifton Aldred was likely to know or suspect about her movements. She had gone into Harding early, before the main business day. Ruth Colby was not the kind of woman who announced her visitors. But small valleys had long sight lines and people talked without meaning to. And she had perhaps 3 or 4 days before Aldred became aware that she was actively building a case rather than sitting in progressive desperation, waiting for her financial position to force a decision. 3 or 4 days to find Sadie Pruitt and have a conversation that might go in any direction. She went to find Sadie the following morning, riding into Harding on the bay mare with the practiced efficiency of someone who has made the trip many times and has stopped counting them. The dry goods that Sadie Pruitt ran from the front room of her late father's house was not precisely a store, more an arrangement where she kept household supplies and specialty items that the general store didn't stock, and the community understood that if you needed certain things you went to Sadie's front room, and Sadie either had it or knew who did. It was the kind of small economy that small communities generated without much planning. Sadie Pruitt, 40 years old, answered the door in her working dress with a look that shifted rapidly through several expressions when she registered who was standing on her step. Not fear exactly, something more complicated. The face of a woman who had been thinking about a thing and now found the thing had come to her door before she'd finished deciding what she thought about it. "Mrs. Rourke." She stepped back. "Come in." The front room was exactly what Alma expected: shelves of household goods, bolts of fabric, a smell of cedar and dried herbs. They sat in the 2 chairs near the window because Sadie did not offer the back room, which suggested she was not yet sure how private she wanted this conversation to be. "I need to ask you something directly," Alma said, "and I need you to know that whatever you tell me or don't tell me, I am not going to make trouble for you. I understand what Aldred can do to arrangements that people depend on in this valley, and I'm not asking you to put anything on the line that you haven't decided for yourself is worth putting there." Sadie looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. She had the broad, capable hands of a woman who had done physical work most of her life. and she held them still in the deliberate way people hold things still when they are thinking hard. "My cousin Chester works out at Aldred's place," she said. "Does the perimeter and grounds work?" "I know. Chester told me something last month. He told me because he didn't know what to do with it, and he trusts me more than he trusts most people." She looked up. "I've been trying to figure out what to do with it myself since then." Alma waited. "My father kept the irrigation equipment for Aldred's operation for 15 years. He was a careful man, my father. He kept records of everything he did when he serviced, what parts he replaced, what the condition of each component was at each inspection. He was proud of those records." Sadie's voice was steady, but the steadiness had work in it. "When he died, I kept his record books because they were his and I couldn't throw them out. I've never had reason to look at them until Chester told me what he'd heard at the Aldred operation." "What did Chester hear?" "That the valve on the shared channel to your property had been closed on a specific date in June, and that the date was before the county order." She paused. "Chester heard the date from one of the hands who'd been there that day. He didn't think much of it at first. Then he heard about the county hearing you're apparently requesting, and he told me because he thought I should know given my father's records." Alma kept her expression where she needed it to be, which took effort. "Your father's records would show the valve service history. They show everything he ever touched on that property, dated and signed." Sadie stood and went to the shelves along the back wall. She reached behind a bolt of dark blue wool and brought out a cloth-covered journal, clearly old, clearly handled many times. She set it on the table between them. "June 17th. My father recorded closing the main shared channel valve on the Rourke property side, at the direction of Mr. Aldred, under instruction that it was to be logged as scheduled maintenance." She opened the journal to a page she had clearly already found and marked. He also wrote a personal note in the margin. "My father made personal notes sometimes when something sat wrong with him." She turned the journal so Alma could see. The margin note was in a different ink, older, slightly faded, written in the cramped hand of a man recording something quickly and quietly. It read, "Not broken, not scheduled, don't know why." 4 words and a period. 4 words and a period that meant the valve had been closed on Clifton Aldred's instruction 3 weeks before the drought order, with no legitimate maintenance reason, by a careful man who had noticed the absence of legitimate reason and written it down because he was a careful man, and it sat wrong with him and he needed to record it somewhere, even if he never showed it to anyone. "He never showed this to anyone?" Alma asked. "Not while he was alive." Sadie closed the journal and held it in both hands. "He needed the work, Mrs. Rourke. He had me to provide for after my mother passed, and the Aldred operation paid steadily and kept its agreements with him. He was not a man who looked for trouble, but he also wasn't a man who could falsify a record, so if he wrote the truth of it and put it somewhere, it wouldn't cause problems while he was still the one who had to live with the consequences." The room was quiet except for the sound of a wagon passing in the street outside, a completely ordinary sound. The world going about its business again, indifferent to what was shifting inside this small front room. "Would you be willing to present this at a county water board hearing?" Alma asked. "With a signed statement of your own explaining how and when you found it and what your father's records represent?" Sadie Pruitt sat with the journal in her lap for a long moment. Alma did not fill the silence because she understood what was moving through it, the calculation of a woman without a great deal of margin for error, measuring what she stood to lose against what she stood to gain, and against the third thing that didn't fit neatly into either category, which was what it cost to know something was wrong and keep quiet about it. "Chester will lose his position at Aldred's if this comes out," Sadie said finally. "He knows that. I talked to him this morning before you came because I thought you might come." She looked at Alma with the directness of someone who has made a hard decision and is not going to apologize for the difficulty of it. "Chester said to do what's right. He said he'd find other work." Alma thought about the kind of people it took to make a valley function, the maintenance men who kept equipment running honestly, the dry goods operators who kept track of what their communities needed, the cousins who told each other the truth and then said, "Do what's right." None of them particularly powerful, all of them necessary. "I'll get you what protection I can through the county process," Alma said. "Signed statements entered into official record have weight. Once it's in the record, his ability to retaliate without scrutiny is reduced. I know how records work. Sadie's voice had a dry edge to it that was the first indication that she had a sense of humor somewhere under the gravity of the conversation. My father taught me that. She set the journal on the table between them. I'll sign a statement. You can have this to present. I want it back after, but you can present it. Alma rode back to Rourke Hollow in the full heat of the late morning, with the journal wrapped in cloth in her saddlebag alongside Ruth Colby's folders. And she felt the shape of the case forming the way ground forms under your feet in the dark, not visible yet but solid. The specific solidity of something that has been there longer than you knew. She came up the drive and knew immediately that something had changed. Boone was at the fence line on the east boundary, not doing anything, just standing there. That was unusual enough to register. Boone in motion was unremarkable. Boone standing completely still was not. She rode toward him, and he turned when he heard the mare, and his expression was the controlled kind that people wore when they were managing what they didn't want to show in their face. He knows, Boone said when she was close enough. Aldred knows you've been asking questions. I don't know how. Possibly someone saw you going to Ruth Colby's this morning. Possibly word got back from somewhere else. But I just came from the Aldred fence line on my north border. He had been walking his perimeter, which he did regularly. He had 2 men there, not doing anything, just present, the kind of presence that's a message. Alma looked at the east fence line where Aldred's land began. Nothing visible there now, but she understood what Boone was describing, the kind of statement made by the physical presence of resources, the reminder that the other party in a dispute had manpower to deploy in ways that didn't require direct confrontation. He's moving faster than I expected. He's moving faster than he planned to. Boone said it with a specific quality she caught, an assessment rather than reassurance. Which means he's not as comfortable as he looked. A man who's fully confident in his position doesn't need to remind his neighbor that he has hands to spare. That was a useful piece of information. A rattled man made different kinds of mistakes than a patient one, but a rattled man with resources was also more likely to escalate in ways that were difficult to predict. She needed the county hearing scheduled before Aldred could apply enough pressure to delay or redirect it. She needed Ruth Colby's documents officially submitted and on record. And she needed Sadie Pruitt's statement in her hand before Aldred had any reason to approach Sadie directly. That evening, the work trailer they'd been using to haul water from the co-op came back from its second run of the day, with a loose wheel bearing that ground, and screamed for the last quarter mile up the drive, and then gave out entirely at the barn door. Repairable, but not tonight and not cheaply. They had 12 hours of water in the holding tank. 12 hours for 26 head of cattle and the vegetable rows in the household. After that, they hauled in buckets from the well near the windmill foundation, which was slow and limited by what the nascent spring could provide at its current unimproved flow. Nessa had been at the windmill foundation again that afternoon. She came in for supper with dirt on her vest and leather gloves, and the focused expression that meant she had confirmed something she'd been tracking. The flow has increased since we opened the channel last night, she said, washing her hands at the basin. Not dramatically, but measurably. Whatever was sealed under there, opening it has allowed the pressure to equalize. Given time and a proper casing, I think it produces enough water to supply the household and the herd without the trailer runs. Given time, Alma said. A few weeks. Maybe less if the casing is done well and the pump positioned correctly. Nessa dried her hands on the kitchen towel and sat down at the table. I talked to Mr. Hennessy at the well company this morning when I rode in for the mail. He said he could come out and assess it properly, do the casing, install a hand pump. He quoted a price. She pushed a folded piece of paper across the table. Alma looked at the number on the paper. It was not a large number in the context of what a properly functioning water source would be worth to this operation. It was a very large number in the context of what she had in the account at the First Territorial Bank of Harding. She set it down. I'll figure out the money. She had approximately 1 item of value left that she could convert without compromising the operation. Thomas's pocket watch, which was a fine one made by a good maker, and which she had not been willing to part with until now, because it was the last object she owned that she could hold and feel Thomas in entirely. But she was not going to let the sentiment of a watch stand between her and the operational security of this ranch. And Thomas would have told her the same thing in exactly those words if he'd been there to say them. She took it out of the drawer where she kept it and held it for a long moment in the lamplight, feeling the weight of it, and then she wrapped it in a piece of felt and put it in her jacket pocket for the morning. Boone arrived after supper and didn't knock. He came around to the kitchen door and knocked once and came in when Nessa called, carrying a small crate of provisions that he set on the counter without comment. Eggs, a wheel of hard cheese, a paper of salt pork. He had surplus from his smaller operation, and he was not going to perform any ceremony about providing it, which was the only way Alma was going to allow it. They sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread between them again, and Alma showed him Sadie's journal and the margin note in her father's handwriting. Boone read it twice, as he had read everything, and set it down with the same care. "That's the fourth piece," he said, "and it's the one that changes the character of everything else. Without it, he can argue the other documents speak to historical facts and administrative oversights. With it, there's a direct line from his instructions to a specific act on a specific date, before the order that would have justified it." "I know." Alma looked at the margin note. "Not broken. Not scheduled. Don't know why. He was a careful man, her father. The careful ones always leave the best records." Boone looked at her across the documents. "We need to request the hearing formally this week, before he has time to build any kind of preemptive argument with the board members he knows." Alma had been thinking about the timing since she rode back from Sadie's house. The county water board met on the first and third Friday of the month. The next meeting was Friday of the following week, which gave them 6 days to formally submit the hearing request and the supporting documents through the county clerk's office. 6 days was enough. Barely enough, but enough. "I'll go to the clerk's office tomorrow morning," she said. "I should come." Boone said it carefully, with the awareness of what he was offering, and what it might imply in a valley where people tracked the movements of their neighbors. "I know the county clerk. We worked together when I was still in the office. He'll process the submission correctly and not allow it to get lost in a filing category." The implication hung in the air between them that without that particular relationship, a formal submission might be delayed or misfiled, in the way the 1889 water assessment had been misfiled. That Aldred's relationships in the county apparatus were not confined to the water board itself. "I know what it looks like," Alma said, "the two of us going in together. It looks like a formal legal proceeding with a witness to the submission." His voice was even. "Which is exactly what it is." She looked at him across the table and thought about the specific quality of this man's directness, not the warmth that Thomas had operated with, open and expansive and pulling everyone into his orbit, but something quieter and more particular, more like the way good stonework held together, not decorative, not seeking notice, just exactly placed and effective because of it. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow morning." Nessa had moved to the other end of the table and was doing something with her journal that involved a fresh page and a list of items written in careful columns. She did not look up, but the small, settled quality of her posture suggested she was glad of the answer. They worked through the documents for another 2 hours, organizing them in the order of argument they wanted to present. The 1863 survey first, establishing historical ownership of the spring resource. The 1889 water assessment second, establishing the geological independence of the aquifer from Aldred's system. The 1879 letter third, establishing Aldred's prior knowledge, and Sadie Pruitt's signed statement with her father's journal last, establishing the specific act that connected Aldred's knowledge to deliberate action. At some point past 9 in the evening, reaching for the same document at the same moment, Alma and Boone's hands came to rest on the same folder. Neither of them moved for a moment. It was not a significant thing. 2 people working late over documents that mattered. 2 people who had each learned through the particular education of loss how not to waste time on pretense. She moved her hand first. He slid the folder across to her without comment and picked up his coffee cup, which had been empty for an hour. "There's one thing that worries me," Alma said, smoothing the 1889 assessment in front of her. "You approved the administrative filing of this document when you were county sheriff. Aldred's lawyer is going to raise that." The pause before Boone answered was not the pause of a man deciding what to say. It was the pause of a man choosing how much of what was true to bring into the room. "He will, and he'll be right to raise it. I processed a filing request from Aldred's legal office in 1889, and I approved it for administrative storage rather than public record, because the reason given for that categorization appeared legitimate on its face. I did not read the underlying document with the care I should have applied to anything coming from Aldred's office. He set the cup down. That was a failure of judgment on my part. A significant one. It's the kind of failure a skilled lawyer can turn into reasonable doubt about the whole submission, Alma said. Not to wound him, to name the actual problem, which was the only way to address it. Yes. He met her eyes without deflection. Which is why I need to be the one who addresses it directly, rather than waiting for Aldred's lawyer to raise it as a surprise. The board needs to hear from me that I made an error in that filing, and that I have specific knowledge of how the error was created by a misfiling request that was designed to look routine. I can speak to the practice of administrative manipulation in county records because I spent 15 years watching how it worked. My acknowledging my own failure in that particular transaction and explaining its context is more credible than anything that comes from being put on the defensive. She studied his face for a moment. It had taken her a long time to understand that certain kinds of strength did not look like strength from the outside, that the willingness to stand in front of your own mistake without mitigating it was a harder thing than most of what got called bravery. That'll be the line Aldred's lawyer attacks hardest, she said. Your credibility. I know, he said it quietly, with the equanimity of a man who has had 4 years to make his peace with the shape of his history. I'd rather be attacked for what I actually did than for something I'm pretending didn't happen. She was going to say something in response. She had started to form the words. But then Nessa's voice came from the other end of the table, calm and focused, without looking up from the journal. We have a problem. Both of them looked at her. Nessa turned the journal around to show a page in her column list format. On one side, the 4 pieces of evidence, numbered. On the other side, a single name, circled. I went back through the 1,879 letter tonight while you were talking. The survey company's letter was signed by the lead surveyor and countersigned by a witness. The witness' signature is a name, and I recognize the name because I've seen it in the county water board notices that come through the post office. She tapped the circled name on her page. He's a current sitting member of the Harding Valley County Water Board. The kitchen held its quiet for a breath. Aldred's knowledge of the spring wasn't just personal and strategic. He had a direct connection through a document that named one of his historical associates to someone currently seated on the body that would hear this case. Not necessarily a corrupt connection. Not necessarily anything that could be challenged. But the kind of proximity that experienced men used without ever needing to make it explicit. Tomorrow, Boone said, and the word had a different weight than it had carried at the start of the evening. We file tomorrow before he has any more time to work with. Alma looked at the circled name in Nessa's careful handwriting and felt the case she was building become, in that moment, slightly more complicated and simultaneously more urgent in the specific way of things that cannot be made simpler by hoping they might be. Outside, the Colorado night was the particular dark of high country, in late summer vast and clear and indifferent to the concerns of the small human structures beneath it. The cattle would need water in the morning. The wheel bearing on the trailer needed repair before the next run. The pocket watch sat in her jacket pocket, heavy and familiar. The documents lay spread on the kitchen table, organized and evidence-worthy, and not quite enough on their own. She reached over and moved the lamp closer to the board, throwing its yellow light across the spread documents, and began going through them one more time from the beginning, looking for anything she had missed, because thoroughness was the only advantage she had over a man who had more of everything else, and she was not going to go into that hearing room with a single gap she hadn't already found and sealed herself. Boone pulled his chair closer to the lamp without being asked and began going through them beside her. And neither of them mentioned the hour or the length of the day preceding it, because some things are simply worth the time they take. She was gone before Boone's lamp went on across the north pasture. 4:30 in the morning, still dark enough that the stars had not yet begun to thin at the eastern edge. Alma had the bay mare saddled in the dark barn by feel, the way she did everything in the early months after Thomas died, when getting up and moving before the grief could get fully organized was the only way to get up at all. She moved quietly, not from any particular need for stealth, but from the ingrained habit of early mornings on a working ranch, where noise before dawn disturbed the cattle and woke people who needed their sleep. She tied the saddlebag with Ruth Colby's folders and Sadie's journal inside it, checked the cinch twice the way Thomas had always checked it, and then checked it again after he died because there was no one left to check it for her, and rode out before the light changed. The ride into Harding took 40 minutes on the main road, and 35 if she cut across the dry creek bed at the Fenwick property line, which she did, and the bay mare picked her way across the pale stones of the empty creek with the careful attention of an animal that had made that crossing many times in better conditions, and remembered how the footing worked even when the water was gone. The sky above the ridge went from black to deep blue to the particular color that comes just before dawn, which has no good name but which Alma had always thought of as the color of a decision not yet made visible. She reached Harding as the first storefront lamps were being lit. The county clerk's office did not open until 8, which she knew, which meant she had 2.5 hours to wait. She tied the mare at the rail outside the feed store and sat on the bench along the front wall with her saddlebag across her knees and waited, which she was better at than most people assumed. At 7:10, she saw movement at the clerk's office window, someone inside, early, before the official hour. She crossed the street and knocked. The man who opened the door was not the county clerk. He was younger, a deputy clerk named Aldous Carr, who had worked in the office for 6 years and who Alma knew by sight and occasional transaction. He looked at her across the doorway, with the expression of a man calculating whether what was being asked of him at 7:10 in the morning was within the scope of what he was willing to provide. "The clerk doesn't come in until 8, Mrs. Rourke. I'm aware. I'd like to submit a formal hearing request to the County Water Board, and I'd like to do it now, before the office opens officially, with you as witness to the time and content of submission." She held out the submission envelope she had prepared at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning after Boone had ridden home, properly addressed, sealed, and inscribed on the exterior, with the formal heading that county procedure required. "I'd also like a receipt for the submission, dated and timed, signed by you in your capacity as deputy clerk." Aldous Carr looked at the envelope. He looked at her face. He was not a man who had any particular relationship with Clifton Aldred. She had considered that before choosing him over the clerk himself, who had attended Aldred's annual summer gathering at Blackwood Ranch for the past 4 years running, a fact she knew because Ruth Colby had mentioned it once in the context of something else entirely, and Alma had filed it the way she filed things, without knowing yet when it would matter. The procedure for emergency hearing requests allows for submission outside regular hours in cases of documented ongoing harm, she said. The valve closure constitutes ongoing harm to a working agricultural operation. That qualifies. Aldous Carr was quiet for another moment. Then he stepped back from the door. She went in and watched him find the receipt book in the second drawer of the front desk, and she watched him write the time at the top of the receipt form 7:14 in the morning and sign his name below it, and stamp it with the office seal, and hand it to her. She was back on the mare and halfway to Rourke Hollow before 8 o'clock. Boone was at the kitchen door when she rode in, which meant he had gone to her house when he saw she wasn't there, which meant he had noticed she left early and had not gone back to his own work but had come to check. He was holding a coffee cup and wearing the expression of a man who has made a decision about whether to say something and decided to say a version of it. "You went without me. I went before 6. She dismounted and started unsaddling the mare, and he came around to help without asking, taking the saddlebag while she pulled the saddle. "You said you knew the clerk. I didn't use the clerk. I used Aldous Carr and I went before the office opened, so there was no opportunity for the submission to be redirected before it was formally receipted." A pause while he absorbed that. That was smarter than what I suggested. It was what the situation called for. She was not being cutting. She was stating a fact, the way he stated facts. She handed him the receipt and he read it and handed it back. "The hearing is now formally requested. They have 7 days to schedule it under emergency provision, which puts it either this Friday or next Friday at the latest." "He'll know by noon," Boone said. "He'll know by 10. Someone will see the submission in the daily intake and word will move." She took the saddlebag back and walked toward the house, which means we have the morning before his lawyer starts working on a response. Nessa was already at the windmill foundation when Alma came around the house, kneeling on a folded piece of burlap she'd brought out to save her dress from the dirt, using a hand trowel to carefully widen the channel they'd opened in the stone work. The spring flow had increased again, overnight visible now as a genuine trickle rather than a seep, collecting in the stone-lined depression they'd cleared, and beginning to find its own level in the carved dirt channel they'd extended toward the nearest trough. Not substantial, but real and steady and alive. "Mr. Hennessy can come Thursday," Nessa said without looking up. "I sent word with the morning mail rider. He'll assess and give a firm price on the casing and pump installation. I told him to come early because we might need the day. I sold your father's watch this morning." Alma said it plainly because there was no way to say it that made it smaller than it was, and she had learned from Thomas that things said plainly hurt less on balance than things said carefully. "To the jeweler on Mill Street." It covered Hennessy's quote and the feed we need for the rest of the month. Nessa was still for a moment, trowel paused in the dirt. Then she pressed her palm flat against the ground near the base of the spring house stones, and kept it there for a count of 10, which was the thing she did when she was absorbing something and needed her hands to be doing something steady. "Papa would have sold it himself 3 months ago," she said finally. "He would have held out 2 months longer than I did and then sold it himself," Alma said. But yes, that was the end of it, which was right. They did not have the resources for a longer grief over the watch. The morning brought the kind of work that held the operation together by the accumulation of its parts. Checking the remaining cattle for condition, finishing the wheel-bearing repair on the water trailer with a replacement part Boone produced from his own stock of spares, without any formal offer made or acknowledgement requested. Rationing the existing water supply through the day until the evening run could replenish the holding tank. Alma did all of it, and did it in the specific forward-leaning mode she had operated in since June. The mode where you did not look at the larger picture more than once a day, because looking at it more than once produced despair, and despair was not useful. At midday, Boone came in from his own property and sat on the porch steps with a sandwich she had not made, and which she understood had come from somewhere in his own kitchen. They ate without much talking and watched the heat rise in white columns off the dry pasture. "There's something I need to tell you before you hear it another way." Boone set his plate down on the step beside him. "I went to see Judge Calloway this morning. I didn't mention it before because I wasn't sure he'd agree to see me. Warren Calloway was the sitting district judge for Harding County. He was not a member of the water board, he had no direct authority over the hearing. But he had been on the bench for 11 years, and he understood the county's legal apparatus in ways that extended well past his formal jurisdiction." "Why Calloway?" she asked. "Because when this hearing happens, Aldred's lawyer is going to attack the validity of Ruth Colby's document storage practices and my credibility as a former county officer. Having a current judicial officer on record as having reviewed the submission documents and finding them procedurally sound, even informally, creates a different context for the board." "You went this morning?" "Before I got back from Harding. I went at 6:30. He was in his garden. He's an early riser." Boone looked at the dry pasture. He agreed to look at the documents informally and give me his assessment of their procedural standing. "He'll do it this afternoon." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had woken before 6 and gone to see a judge without telling her and come back and fixed a wheel bearing without mentioning it. The specific texture of his usefulness was not the loud kind that announced itself. It was the other kind, the kind that was just there when you looked for it, reliably placed, without requiring gratitude as its operating condition. "Calloway knows Aldred," she said. "Everyone in this county knows Aldred. Calloway also knows that his own professional standing depends on being seen to operate independently of county power structures, and a man in his position does not want to be on the wrong side of a water manipulation case if it goes badly public." He was not cynical about it, just accurate. Self-interest and right action sometimes point in the same direction. "I've learned not to be too precious about which one is doing the driving." She thought about the sitting board member whose name appeared as a witness on the 1879 survey letter. The name Nessa had circled in her journal. She had not yet addressed that problem directly. "The board member," she said. "Hendricks." "I know." Boone said it with the tone of someone who had been thinking about the same thing. He witnessed the 1879 letter. That puts him in a room with Aldred's interests before the hearing even starts. "He may have had no idea what the survey letter meant or that it would ever matter," Alma said. "Witnessing a document doesn't imply conspiracy, but it creates a question about whether he should recuse himself from the panel, and that question needs to be raised formally before the hearing rather than during it. where it looks like a tactical disruption. If we raise it formally, Aldred knows we have the letter and knows we've read it carefully enough to find Hendrix's name in it. He already knows we have the documents. Ruth Colby's files are not a secret he can maintain anymore. She stood and picked up her plate. But there's a difference between knowing we have documents and knowing we've identified every implication of them. I'd rather he find out during the hearing when it's too late to prepare a counter. They left it unresolved because both of them knew it was the kind of decision that needed more information before it could be made well, and forcing a decision before its time was the mistake of people who confused motion with progress. She had made that mistake in the first weeks after the valve closure, before she had worked out the full shape of what she was facing, and she had stopped making it when she understood that Aldred's primary advantage was that he had taken his time. That afternoon she went back to the northeast corner with Nessa, and they worked together on the channel extension, deepening it slightly and lining the bottom with the flat stones that Silas Rourke had apparently stockpiled nearby, for exactly this purpose, a detail that kept surfacing in the construction around the windmill foundation. The evidence of a man who had planned carefully and then stopped, for reasons no one still living knew. The water moved into the extended channel and found its level and kept coming. It was quiet and consistent, and it did not require anything from them except the infrastructure to receive it. He knew exactly what he was sitting on, Nessa said, clearing a piece of debris from the channel edge. Silas. He built the spring house, he sealed the cap, he stockpiled the stone. Then he stopped. Maybe he ran out of time. Alma stacked a flat stone into the channel lining. He was 62 when he died. Whatever he meant to build here, he didn't finish it. Or he finished the most important part. Nessa looked at the channel for a moment. He sealed it and protected it. Maybe he didn't know yet what it would become, and he wanted to make sure it stayed intact until someone did. Alma looked at the spring house stones, fitted work, careful work, the kind of labor a man did when he intended it to last longer than himself. She had thought about Silas Rourke abstractly for most of her life, the way you thought about great-grandparents you had never met, as a name attached to the land's origin story. She was thinking about him differently now, as a man who had looked at a piece of ground and understood something about it that other people had missed, and had done the work of preserving that understanding in stone and mortar, so it could not be entirely lost even after he was gone. She understood that impulse fully. The following day brought Clifton Aldred's response, delivered not to her door but to the county clerk's office, in the form of a formal legal objection to the hearing request, filed through his lawyer and citing 5 separate procedural arguments for why the emergency provision she had invoked did not apply. Aldous Carr sent a copy to her address by the afternoon mail rider with a handwritten note at the bottom in his careful clerk's script. Submission stands per deputy clerk's receipt. Hearing scheduled for Friday 10 a.m. She read the legal objection at the kitchen table that evening with Boone beside her and Nessa across from them, and they went through each of the 5 arguments in turn, the way you went through a fence line, looking for the weak spots before someone else found them first. 2 of the 5 were routine procedural challenges that Boone said any county board with functional experience would dismiss in the first 10 minutes. One was a more serious argument about the classification of the 1,889 water assessment and whether documents stored under administrative filing could be submitted as primary evidence in a water rights hearing. That's the one he cares about, Boone said. The other 4 are scaffolding. This is the load-bearing wall. He tapped the relevant paragraph. He's arguing that the 1,889 assessment was filed in a non-public record category by proper administrative process, and therefore cannot be treated as suppressed evidence. It was categorized, not concealed. It was categorized on his instruction through his lawyer for the explicit purpose of keeping it out of public record, Alma said. Yes, which we can demonstrate through Ruth Colby's testimony about the filing request she received. But his lawyer will argue that Ruth Colby is a retired clerk with a personal recollection of an event that happened 35 years ago, and that personal recollection without contemporaneous documentation is insufficient to establish intent. The word intent sat in the middle of the table between them, like something neither of them wanted to pick up before they were ready for it. Intent was what separated a man who had made advantageous use of available information from a man who had engaged in deliberate manipulation of public records and shared water resources. Intent was what they had, and it was also what was hardest to prove to a standard that a county water board would accept over a skilled lawyer's objections. Ruth made a note, Alma said, when the filing request came through. She told me she noted it as unusual at the time. Did she say the note was in writing? Alma thought back through the conversation at Ruth Colby's house. The careful way Ruth had pulled the folders. The specificity of her memory. The comment about professional habit. She had said she kept a copy of the assessment. She had said she made a note of the unusual filing request. She had not said whether that note was written down or simply part of her strong recollection. I need to go back to Ruth, she said. Tonight? She looked at the hour. Late enough that riding into Harding and knocking on Ruth Colby's door was on the edge of acceptable. First thing tomorrow. She rode into Harding the next morning at 7 again. Not because she had developed a habit of pre-dawn departures, but because the urgency of the situation did not adjust itself to her preference for sleep, and she had learned a long time ago that urgency respected nothing except the work done in response to it. Ruth Colby opened the door in the same house dress as before, and looked at Alma with the expression of a woman who had been expecting her. Come in. I found something last night after you left the other day that I meant to send with you and forgot. This was not what Alma had come to ask about, which made it better. Ruth led her to the cabinet, and from it produced a small bound record book, the kind that county offices of the previous generation had used for departmental correspondence logs, each entry dated, a brief description of the document received or sent, and the clerk's initials. Ruth opened it to a page marked with a strip of paper and set it in front of Alma. The entry was dated August of 1889. The description read, Water assessment received from county survey contractor, per request of Aldred, Siri, Rourke Hollow aquifer data. Filing instruction received via Attorney Greer, administrative internal, not public land record. Filed per instruction. Note unusual categorization for this document type. Initialed RC, a contemporaneous written record. Made at the time. In the official departmental log of the county clerk's office. Not a memory, not a recollection. Not something that could be characterized as an elderly woman's reconstruction of events 3 decades after the fact. A record entry, properly dated, bearing Ruth Colby's initials, made in the ordinary course of her official duties at the moment the unusual instruction was received. Alma read it twice. Then she sat back in the chair and let the weight of it settle. I found it when I was going through the logbooks after you came the first time, Ruth said. I wasn't certain I'd kept it. But I am a thorough record keeper by nature, and apparently I was thorough even in 1889. There was a dryness in her voice that was not quite humor, and not quite pride, the tone of a woman acknowledging that her own careful habits have turned out to matter more than she knew they would when she formed them. This is the thing that was missing, Alma said. May I take it? I made a copy yesterday for your purposes. The original stays with me. Ruth produced a carefully handwritten transcription of the log entry, signed and dated by herself in the current year, with a note below attesting to its accuracy as a copy of the original entry in the departmental log. That should answer the question of contemporaneous documentation. Alma rode back to Rourke Hollow, with Ruth Colby's copy in her saddlebag, and felt the case close around its own shape the way a good gate closes, not forcefully, without drama, just the final engagement of the latch that means it will hold. Boone was at the Windmill Foundation when she came in, talking to a man she recognized as Jed Hennessy from the Well Company, a lean, gray-haired man in work clothes, who was crouching at the edge of the spring channel with a measuring rod and a focused expression. Nessa was beside him with her journal, writing down whatever numbers he was reading from the rod, because Nessa did not watch any information-producing process without recording the output. Alma waited at the edge of their working radius until Hennessy stood up and looked at her with the direct expression of a man delivering a professional assessment. The flow rate is better than I'd expect from a natural spring this size, even in a dry year, Hennessy said. The aquifer feeding it is stable. There's no sign of seasonal variation in the soil temperature differential around the source, which usually indicates a deep feed rather than a surface collection. I think your great-grandfather capped it because he knew capping it would maintain pressure and keep the source from depleting through evaporation over the years. He paused. Smart man. He was, Alma said. If we case it properly and set a hand pump here, he indicated a point 2 feet from the current channel opening, You'll have reliable water for the household and the cattle herd at your current numbers. More than reliable. You could run a modest irrigation line to your nearest fields if you wanted. What's the cost? He named a figure. It was within the range of what Thomas's watch had covered, with a small margin remaining. She told him to schedule the work for the following week, after the hearing, because she did not want the construction activity to be visible before the board had ruled and the legal status of the spring was confirmed. Hennessy packed his measuring equipment and rode off down the drive, and Nessa closed her journal, and for a moment, the three of them stood at the spring channel in the late morning sun and listened to the quiet, persistent sound of water moving through the stone-lined channel they had built for it, heading toward the trough that the cattle were already beginning to find their way to, with the patient instinct of animals that sense a change in supply before they can see the source of it. Then Boone said, "There's something I haven't told you." Alma looked at him. "I received a letter this morning from Aldred's lawyer, addressed to me personally, not through the county process." He reached into his vest pocket and handed her the folded letter. "He's threatening to raise my approval of the 1,889 filing in the hearing as evidence that I was complicit in the suppression of the document, not just negligent complicit. He's going to argue that my involvement in this case is motivated by self-interest in deflecting my own culpability." She read the letter. It was 3 paragraphs of legal language that translated, in plain terms, to, "We know your weak point, and we are going to put it in the center of the room where everyone can see it, and we are going to make the story of this hearing about your integrity rather than our client's conduct." "He's trying to get you to withdraw," she said. "Yes. Are you going to?" He took the letter back, folded it, and put it in his vest pocket with the same deliberate economy with which he did everything. "No." She looked at him across the channel where the water moved quietly between them. This was the moment, kindness, where his presence she understood, where his presence in this fight became something she could not take for granted, where she had to acknowledge that what she was asking him to stand in by continuing was a public attack on his reputation by a skilled lawyer in front of a county panel, on behalf of a woman who was not his family and not his legal obligation, and not anything except a neighbor who had needed someone to stand on her side of a fence line. "He may do real damage to how people in this valley see you," she said. "Whatever happens at the hearing. People in this valley have seen me since I sold the Hartwell place and stayed on the property I bought next to yours. They've made their assessments." His voice was even, not resigned, more like a man who has carried a thing long enough to know its exact weight. "Whatever damage Aldred's lawyer does in that room, I did the larger part of it myself 4 years ago when I decided a filing instruction was routine enough not to read carefully. I'd rather stand up in that hearing and say so plainly than let Aldred use it as a lever while I'm standing somewhere else." She took that in, the specific shape of it. A man who had made a mistake with consequences he had spent years understanding. Standing in the exact place the mistake pointed back toward, choosing to face it rather than create distance from it. She had met a great many people in her life, and she could count on her working hand the ones who had that particular quality, the willingness to own the thing fully, without the self-protective softening that was the natural human impulse. "You should know," she said carefully, "that your being here, being willing to be here, is the reason I believe we can actually win this." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she had not seen from him before, something that moved across his face and then settled into the usual steadiness, leaving a different quality behind it, something that had less distance in it than the expression that preceded it. "That's the first time," he said, "in a considerable number of years, that someone has told me that I am the reason something might succeed." A pause. I'd forgotten what that felt like. She did not have an immediate answer for that. She held it for a moment, the specific human weight of a person acknowledging that they had been too long without being necessary to something that mattered, and she thought about the particular loneliness of competence unused, which she understood from the inside. Nessa had been walking toward the house with her journal under her arm, and she was now at enough distance that her voice came back slightly carried by the wind. "I'm making supper. Neither of you eat enough." Which was the kind of thing that broke the specific gravity of a particular moment in a way that felt entirely right. That night, after supper, after Nessa had gone to her room and the house was quiet, Alma sat at the kitchen table with the organized hearing submission in front of her and went through the order of presentation one more time. She was adding Ruth Colby's departmental log entry copy to the sequence. When she heard Boone's step on the porch, she recognized it now. The specific weight and rhythm of it. The way you learn the sounds of someone who came to your door, often enough to distinguish them from other sounds. She did not call out. He knocked once and she said to come in. He sat across from her and looked at the organized documents, and did not say anything about them, which she understood to mean he had nothing to add to the work they had already done together on this, and had come for a different reason or no particular reason, which was its own kind of reason. They sat for a while. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the cattle moved once and settled. She was the one who finally said it, because she was not a woman who sat with unsaid things when the saying of them was appropriate. When this is over, when the hearing is finished and whatever happens has happened, I don't know what I'm going to do with the amount of space that's been taken up by all of this. I've been so focused on the immediate problem for so long that I haven't thought about what comes after. There's always another problem after, Boone said. The trick is making sure the next one is a better class of problem than the current one. She laughed, a real one, unexpected, which produced a surprised expression on his face, and then something that was not quite a smile but occupied the space where one would be. She had not laughed in several months in any way that was not the automatic performance of normalcy. This one had nothing performed in it. You were a county officer for 15 years, she said. You spent 14 of them making judgments about the right action in situations with no good options. What made you decide to stop? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer, which she would have accepted. Then Margaret got sick on a Thursday in November. I was in Granville, settling a boundary dispute that had been running for 6 years, and was finally at a resolution point, and I stayed to finish it because I had promised both parties an answer by the end of that week, and I kept my promises. The lamp threw its light on the table between them. I got back Saturday morning. She died Saturday evening. The kitchen was very still. I kept the promise to 2 ranchers about a fence line, he said. She kept everything else. Alma did not say that he could not have known. She did not say that staying was not wrong, given what he understood at the time. She understood that he had already been through every version of that argument with himself over 4 years, and that none of them had resolved the thing or made the shape of the loss any different. You did not help a person by offering them a better interpretation of the thing they already knew the worst version of. You helped them by sitting in the same room with it and not looking away. So she did not look away. After a while she said, Thomas was checking the west fence in a November storm. He'd been meaning to do it for a week and kept putting it off because of weather, and then decided the weather was less of a problem than an unrepaired fence. She looked at the table surface, the scarred wood that Thomas had sat at for years. I used to think that if I'd just suggested he wait one more day, or gone with him, or noticed the storm was getting worse before he rode out. I gave all of that up eventually. It didn't fit the shape of who he was. He was going to ride out to that fence, and I was going to let him, because that was who we both were. Boone was looking at her with the quality of attention that was different from his usual focused practicality, quieter, more interior. How long did it take to give it up? Longer than I'll admit to most people. That's honest. I've found honesty is less expensive than the alternatives in the long run, she said, even when the immediate cost of it is high. He was still looking at her. She was looking at him. There was a length of time that passed in which both of them were fully aware of the other person in the room in a way that was distinct from the preceding months of practical adjacency, and neither of them did anything about it, which was the right choice for the particular evening this was, and both of them knew that too. Friday, he said eventually. Friday, she agreed. He went home. She sat for a little longer at the table and then went to bed. The spring outside moved its small amount of water steadily through the stone channel in the dark, heading toward the trough where the cattle would drink in the morning, indifferent to hearings and lawyers and the weight of particular evenings. Just water, doing what water did when you gave it a clear path and got out of its way. She slept better than she had in weeks. The next morning she found on the kitchen table a folded note in Nessa's handwriting, set precisely where she would see it. When she came down, I went to check the spring before first light. The flow increased again overnight. Hennessy was right about the deep feed. This one doesn't stop. Alma read it standing in the kitchen in the early morning with her boots still in her hand, and she thought about Silas Rourke, standing in the same valley, in a different August, in a different drought perhaps. looking at a piece of ground and understanding something about its nature that other people had not troubled themselves to notice. She thought about what it meant to know a thing and protect it and seal it away carefully for someone who would come later and need it, without knowing who that person would be or whether they would be paying attention when the time came. She put her boots on and went out to look at the water. It was still coming, quiet and steady and cold and entirely real, finding its way through the channel they had built for it toward the trough where 26 cattle were already gathering in the pale morning light, pressing together at the edge, drinking with the unself-conscious urgency of animals that had been waiting a long time for something they trusted was coming. She stood and watched them drink, and did not allow herself to feel relieved yet, because Friday was still 2 days away, and Clifton Aldred still had 2 days, and a skilled lawyer, and the specific patience of a man who had been planning this for 8 years and would not concede a single moment of those 8 years without using every resource available to him. But the water was there, and it was hers, and now she could prove it. Sadie Pruitt came to the door at 8:30 on Wednesday evening. Not Boone's knock. She had learned his knock the way you learned the sound of a specific gate latch, the particular weight and rhythm of it. This one was smaller. The knock of someone who had stood on the step for a moment before committing to it, who had walked up the path and then paused and then decided. Sadie stood in the porch light in her dark wool dress, good boots, hat in both hands turning slowly at the brim. Her face carried the look of a woman who had made a hard decision and was now committed past the point of reconsidering it, but had not yet finished being afraid of what she'd committed to. "I should have come Monday," she said. "I've been fighting with myself about it since then." Alma stepped back from the door. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. Nessa brought coffee and took herself to the window seat with her journal, close enough to hear but angled away, in the manner she used when she understood that a conversation needed witnesses more than participants. Outside, the August night had cooled to the point where the air through the open window carried the first suggestion of what the season would eventually become. Not autumn yet, just the memory of it, a promise carried in the temperature that summer wasn't permanent. "Chester came to see me this afternoon," Sadie said. Her hands were wrapped around the cup. "He went out to the Aldred operation this morning for his regular work. They turned him away at the gate. No explanation. Just finished." The weight of it settled into the kitchen. Chester Pruitt, who had told his cousin to do what was right, had lost his position at Aldred Cattle Company within 48 hours of the hearing request being filed. The timing required no interpretation. "He knows Chester talked to you," Alma said. "He knows something." Sadie looked at her directly, the way people looked when they had stopped managing what they showed. "Chester doesn't blame himself. He said to tell you that if it matters and he thinks it does, then the cost is the cost and he'll find other work." A pause that had weight in it. "When I heard about Chester, I stopped arguing with myself." Alma looked at this woman, who had spent 2 days in private dispute about what her dead father's careful record-keeping required of her, and who had resolved that dispute in the way that people built. A certain way, always resolved it eventually, not by convincing themselves into courage, but by arriving at the point where staying quiet cost more than speaking. "I'll sign whatever statement you need," Sadie said. "And I want to say it in that room myself. My father kept that record because he couldn't falsify his own work. That meant something to him. I want it to mean something now." Alma set her cup down. "We write the statement tonight." She drafted it by hand at the table, careful with the language, specific about facts, free of anything that could be reframed as interpretation. Sadie read it twice and signed her name at the bottom with the same deliberate quality her father had used initialing his log entries. A person taking formal responsibility for a formal truth. She left at 10:30 with a copy for herself and the signed original with Alma, and when she walked to her horse, her posture was different from the woman who had stood on the porch, turning her hat brim. Not lighter, steadier. Boone arrived 20 minutes after Sadie left. He had seen the unfamiliar horse at Alma's rail from across the north pasture and had waited until it was gone before coming over, which was the kind of judgment he exercised without announcing it. He came through the kitchen door and sat, and Alma showed him the signed statement without preamble. He read it once, set it down. "That's the fourth piece. That's all four," she said. He sat with that for a moment. Outside, the cattle had settled for the night, the particular quiet of animals that had been watered and fed, and had no immediate cause for concern. a quiet that was still new enough at Rourke Hollow to register as remarkable. 3 weeks ago that silence had not existed. "We need to request the hearing formally," he said. "This week. Before he has time to position anyone on the board." Alma had been running the timing since she rode back from Sadie's. The county water board met on the first and third Friday of each month. The next meeting was the coming Friday, which gave them 5 days to submit formally through the county clerk's office. 5 days was enough if they moved in the morning. "I'll go to the clerk's office before it opens," she said. He looked at her. "I know Aldous Carr. I can come with you and not the clerk himself." Carr. "Before the office opens, so the submission is receipted before anyone has cause to redirect it." She looked at Boone across the table. "You know why he did." The county clerk had attended Aldred's summer gatherings for 4 consecutive years. Not an accusation, simply a fact that shaped the strategy. Boone nodded once, without protest, which was the response of a man who understood the difference between his instinct to be useful and the situation's actual need. "Then I'll be here when you get back," he said. After he left, she stayed at the table with the 4 organized folders in front of her and went through the order of argument, one more time, not because she doubted the sequence, but because thoroughness was the only advantage she held over a man with more of everything else, and she had learned not to waste it. The 1863 survey. The 1889 water assessment with Ruth's departmental log entry. The 1879 letter to Aldred. Sadie's signed statement with her father's journal. 4 pieces, each independently sourced, each addressing a different element of the same deliberate pattern. When she finally went to bed, she lay in the dark and did not sleep for a long time. Not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular wakefulness of a person who has done everything available to them and must now wait for the space where the outcome will be determined. She was gone before Boone's lamp went on across the north pasture. 4:15 in the morning. The stars still sharp at altitude, the air cool enough that the bay mare's breath showed faintly as Alma saddled her in the dark barn. She rode into Harding in the pre-dawn, the road empty, the valley floor still carrying the residual dark that lingered in low ground, after the ridge had already begun to catch the first gray of morning. Aldous Carr opened the county clerk's office door at 7:10, with the expression of a man who recognized the quality of early morning urgency and was deciding whether it fell within his professional scope to accommodate it. Alma handed him the submission envelope properly addressed, sealed, inscribed with the formal emergency provision heading, and asked for a receipt dated and timed and signed in his capacity as deputy clerk. He wrote the time at the top of the receipt form. 7:14. Signed his name, stamped the office seal, handed it across. She was back on the mare and halfway to Rourke Hollow before 8 o'clock, the receipt in her vest pocket, the submission formally in the county's hands, and therefore beyond the reach of anyone who might prefer it had arrived differently, or not at all. Boone was at the kitchen door when she rode in. He had come over when he saw she wasn't there, which she had expected. He held a coffee cup and wore the expression of a man who had made a decision about whether to say something and chosen the shorter version of it. "You went without me. I went before 6 and used Carr instead of the clerk." She dismounted and began unsaddling, and he came around to take the saddlebag without being asked. "The submission is formally receipted. Hearing is scheduled for Friday 10 o'clock. He read the receipt she handed him, handed it back. "He'll know by mid-morning. He'll know by 10. Someone will see the daily intake." She walked toward the house with the saddlebag, "which means we have until then before his lawyer starts building a counter." Nessa was already at the windmill foundation when Alma came around the corner of the house, kneeling on a folded piece of burlap to protect her calico dress from the dirt, using a hand trowel to widen the spring channel. The flow had increased again overnight, visible now as a genuine trickle collecting in the stone-lined depression and finding its own level in the channel. They had extended toward the nearest trough, not substantial yet, but steady. The kind of steady that did not depend on surface conditions or human intervention. It simply was, as it had been for generations under the stone, governed by its own internal logic. "Mr. Hennessy can come Thursday," Nessa said, without looking up. "I sent word with the morning mail rider. I told him to come early because we might need the full day." "Good." Alma looked at the spring channel for a moment. "I sold your father's watch this morning, before I went to the clerk's office." Nessa was still. Trowel paused in the dirt. She pressed her palm flat against the ground near the spring house stones, and held it there, the thing she did when she was absorbing something, and needed her hands occupied with something solid and true. He would have sold it himself, Nessa said finally. 2 months ago, probably. He would have held out 3 weeks longer than he should have and then sold it himself, Alma said. But yes, that was the end of it. They did not have the resources for a longer grief over a watch, and Thomas Rourke would have been the first to say so. Boone came around the corner and looked at the spring channel, and then at Nessa's progress with the trowel, and said nothing for a moment, absorbing the information the scene contained. Then Aldred sent 2 men to my north fence line this morning, before I came over. They weren't doing anything, just present. Alma looked at him. He's rattled. He's also resourceful. Boone crouched at the edge of the spring channel and looked at the water moving through it. A rattled man with resources is a different problem than a patient one. He'll escalate in ways we haven't anticipated if we give him time to. Then we don't give him time. She looked at the spring. Thursday, Hennessy does the casing. Friday, the hearing, in that order. The morning's work organized itself around this sequence. There was fence to check on the east boundary. She did it herself, walking the line with the methodical attention of someone who knew that an unmended fence meant potential cattle loss, and that she could not afford that, and that attending to the ordinary work of the ranch during a period of extraordinary pressure was what had kept the operation alive beneath the crisis. The cattle needed checking. The water trailer needed its second run of the day. The vegetable rows along South Slope needed the morning allotment before the heat peaked. She did all of it. Not because any of it was more important than the hearing. Because the hearing was about keeping Rourke Hollow, and Rourke Hollow required tending regardless of what else was happening. Boone came back at midday with a piece of information he had gathered in Harding that morning, his ostensible reason for the ride in being his own supply run, which was true enough to function as cover. Aldred's lawyer had been in the County Water Authority's filing office twice in the preceding 2 days. The clerk, not Carr. The clerk himself had reportedly visited the Aldred main house Wednesday evening. He's managing the board, Boone said. They were standing near the spring channel, the sound of Nessa's trowel work providing enough ambient noise that their conversation did not carry. Not necessarily in any way that crosses a formal line, but making sure his version of events is the most familiar one in the room before we arrive with the evidence. Hendricks, Alma said. The name had been sitting between them since the evening Nessa circled it in her journal. Harold Hendricks, current sitting member of the Harding Valley County Water Board, whose name appeared as a witness signature on the 1879 survey letter, addressed to Clifton Aldred. Not necessarily corrupt, not necessarily anything that could be formally challenged, but the kind of historical proximity that experienced men used without ever needing to make it explicit. I want to raise the recusal question in the room, Boone said, at the opening before any evidence is presented. She had been thinking about this since Nessa circled the name. Raising it publicly forced Hendricks's hand before Aldred's lawyer could frame the hearing's terrain. Not raising it allowed a compromise panel member to sit through the entire proceeding, while Aldred's people worked the room, with the confidence that at least one vote was already managed. It tells them we've read every implication of every document, she said. Good. I want them to know that. He looked at her directly. I don't want to be cautious on Friday. Caution is what I used to call good judgment, and I've learned the difference the hard way. She thought about that for a moment, the specific thing he was describing. The way a man could spend years mistaking restraint for wisdom, until an event arrived that showed him the difference. All right, she said, we raise it at the opening. Thursday arrived with the clarity of air that sometimes came in late August, the heat still present but no longer pressing, as if the atmosphere was beginning to make room for what came next. Jed Hennessy came at 7 as scheduled and spent the morning on the casing and pump installation, and Nessa moved around him, recording measurements in her journal, while Alma managed the cattle and the water supply, and ran the morning's work in the focused forward-leaning mode she had maintained since June. At 3 in the afternoon, Hennessy called her over to the windmill foundation and demonstrated the pump operation. She primed it and worked the handle 3 times, and water came up cold and clear from the ground of Rourke Hollow under her own hand. She pumped water into the stone trough and kept pumping until the trough was full, and the overflow ran into the channel, and she let it run for a moment before she stopped, standing in the late afternoon sun with her hands on the iron handle and feeling the specific sensation of a thing restored to function that had been denied function for 14 months. "Good installation," Hennessy said. "Good work," she said. "Send the invoice to my address in Harding." She had the money to pay it. Barely, but exactly. That evening she did not go back to the kitchen table. She had spent enough evenings at that table with documents spread under lamplight that the table had become its own kind of pressure, its own reminder of everything still unresolved. Instead, she took the organized submission folder out to the front porch and sat in the chair Thomas had built the second year they were married, the one with the particular pitch to the backrest that fit her spine correctly, and she went through the order of argument in the last light of the day, with the valley laid out below the ridge and the air cooling around her. Boone came up the drive on foot rather than on horseback, which meant he had come through the north fence gap and walked across the pasture, which meant he was not arriving for any particular operational reason. He came around the corner of the house and saw her on the porch, and came up the steps and sat on the top step with his back against the post, close enough to talk without raising his voice. "Hennessy's work looks solid," he said. "It is." She set the folder in her lap. "There's something I want to raise before tomorrow. About your position in the hearing." He waited. "Aldred's lawyer is going to attack your credibility. We've known that. But the letter he sent you, the one threatening to frame you as complicit, rather than negligent in the 1889 filing, that's the specific angle he'll use. And I want to know how you intend to answer it." "The same way I'd answer any question about something I did wrong," he said. "Directly? And first, before he has the chance to shape how the room hears it." He was looking out at the valley, where the last light was pulling off the ridge in long gold bands. "I approved that filing. I did it without sufficient care. I know why the oversight was designed to look routine, but knowing why doesn't change the fact that I missed it. I'm going to stand in front of that board and say so in plain language before his lawyer can dress it in the vocabulary of conspiracy. It'll be the hardest moment of the hearing," she said, "for you personally." "I know." He said it without performance. "I've been carrying the weight of that filing for 35 years in one way or another. Standing up and naming it plainly in a county room is not going to be worse than carrying it in silence." A pause. "What's worse is the alternative. Letting Aldred's lawyer define what I did before I can define it myself. I won't do that." She looked at him in the fading light, this large, quiet man, who had spent 4 years on a small property next to hers without seeking notice or proximity, who had told her about Aldred's approach on his land without being asked, who had fixed fence on her side and brought spares from his stock and sat at her kitchen table for weeks, doing the work that the situation required, and who was now preparing to walk into a county hearing room and publicly account for a mistake that had cost him something he had never fully named out loud. "The board will hear it differently from you than from his lawyer," she said. "That's not strategy. That's just true. I know." He turned and looked at her. "You built this case. I want you to know I understand that. Everything that mattered, the documents, Sadie, Ruth, the timeline, that was your work. I was useful. You were the reason." She held that for a moment, not deflecting it, not diminishing it, letting it be what it was. "You were more than useful. You were the person who told me the truth when it was inconvenient for you to tell it. And then you kept telling it every time it would have been easier to stop." She looked at him. "That's not a small thing." The valley had gone to its evening quiet below them. Somewhere in the north pasture one of the cattle moved and settled. The pump at the windmill foundation caught the last light for a moment, its iron handle throwing a small shadow across the stone channel where the water moved in the dark. "There's something I need to say," Boone said. "That doesn't have anything to do with the hearing." She waited. He was looking at the valley, not at her, in the manner of a man who finds it easier to say a true thing when he is not watching someone receive it. "I came to this property because I needed a smaller life than the one I'd been living. Smaller in scope, smaller in ambition. I thought smaller meant safer, less to lose." He paused. "What I didn't account for was that the size of a life isn't what determines its cost. It's who you're living it next to." She did not say anything yet. "I'm not asking you for anything tonight," he said. "I know what tomorrow is, and I know you've been carrying this case for 2 months. And what a person needs after that kind of sustained effort is not another weight, however different its shape." He finally turned and looked at her. "I just want you to know the question exists. When you're ready for it to exist." She looked at him in the dark that had fully come now, with the stars beginning at the eastern edge of the sky. She thought about Thomas, who had asked her to marry him with characteristic directness while they were mending fence in a rainstorm, and had not seemed to notice that the timing was objectively ridiculous. She thought about the specific quality of courage it took to say a true thing plainly and then immediately give the other person room to receive it at whatever pace they needed. "I know the question exists," she said. "I've known it for a while." He held her gaze. And I need more time than tonight." She said it without apology. "Not because I'm uncertain, because I've spent 2 months making decisions on deadline and I'd like this one to breathe." Something moved across his face and settled. Not disappointment, more the recognition of an answer that was consistent with every other thing he had learned about this woman, and the understanding that expecting anything else would have been a failure of his attention. "That's fair," he said. "Take the time you need. It may not be long." He looked at her for a moment in the dark. Then he stood from the step and said, "Friday." "Friday," she agreed. He walked back across the pasture through the dark toward the north fence gap, his large frame moving with the unhurried economy that was his natural mode, and she sat on the porch a while longer in Thomas's chair, and looked at the valley, and felt the specific sensation she had been too busy to feel for months, the sense of a future that had more than one possible shape, and of herself standing at the entrance of it with options rather than imperatives. Inside, Nessa had left a note on the table in her careful handwriting, set where Alma would see it. "Flow increased again tonight. Hennessy was right about the deep feed. This one doesn't stop." She held the note for a moment, then set it on top of the folder. Then she went to bed and slept better than she had in 2 months, which she would not have predicted, and which was perhaps the clearest evidence that the body understood things the mind was still working through. Friday morning arrived with the kind of light that belonged to the specific hour before the valley fully woke, when the ridge caught the sun before the floor did, and the world below was still in the particular blue-gray of early morning. Alma was dressed before 5:30. Her good wool dress, the dark one she kept for occasions requiring it. Her good boots cleaned the night before. The belt Thomas had given her the second year of their marriage, tooled leather, simple silver buckle, neither decorative nor functional exclusively, but something that had always felt like both. She put her hair up properly and looked in the mirror for one moment, not with vanity, but with the practical assessment of a woman who understood that how she arrived in a room sent its own message before she opened her mouth. Boone knocked at 6:10. She had heard his horse at the rail and knew the knock before it came. He came in and she looked at him, and registered that he had made equivalent preparations. A vest she recognized as his best, a clean linen shirt without the baked-in fade of his working clothes, his hat brushed, his boots brought to a condition that required real effort. He looked at her across the kitchen, in the early light, with the expression he had been developing across the preceding months, the one that had started as careful assessment and become something with considerably more interior quality to it. "Ready," he said, almost. She turned toward the back of the house. "Nessa." Nessa appeared in the kitchen doorway in her blue calico dress, the good one, saved for occasions between everyday work clothes and formal Sunday wear, with her journal under one arm and the organized submission folder under the other. She had been up since 5. Alma had heard her moving at the other end of the house. She looked at her mother, looked at Boone with the complete and undemonstrative awareness she brought to everything, and said, "The horses are ready." They rode into Harding 3 abreast where the road allowed, and single file where it narrowed, and the morning was cool enough that the horses moved with the energy of animals glad of a temperature that did not press down on them. Alma rode out front where the road narrowed. Behind her she could hear the sound of Boone's horse, steady, unhurried, the specific presence of it that she had become accustomed to, in the way you became accustomed to a sound that meant something reliable was nearby. The town of Harding at 8:30 on a Friday was more active than the regular weekday traffic accounted for. More horses at the rails. A cluster of people near the general store discussing something with the focused energy of people discussing a shared interest. Word had moved through the valley the way it always moved, and in a valley where water was the margin between surviving the drought and not, a public water hearing was sufficient to draw an audience. Clifton Aldred was at the rail outside the county building when they arrived. Not inside, outside, standing with his lawyer Greer, 2 other men positioned nearby in the manner of presence as statement. He looked at Alma when she dismounted. He looked at Boone. He looked at the submission folder under Nessa's arm. Something moved through his expression and was controlled before it became fully visible, not quite fear, but the alertness of a man registering that the room he had already arranged in his mind may not have been arranged incorrectly. She did not acknowledge him. She tied the mare and walked into the building. The hearing room held the 5-member county water board at the long table, Chairman Hayes at center, then Calloway, Fenwick, Wills, and Hendricks. Harold Hendricks, third from the left, 63 years old, gray-haired, wearing the expression of a man who habitually kept himself toward the back of conversations. He did not meet her eyes when she entered. She found her submission table, set the organized folders down, and looked at the room filling behind her 40-odd people from the valley, people who had avoided her, and people who had quietly helped her, and people who had done neither and simply watched, all of them present now, because water was everyone's business, and the outcome of this hearing would reshape the valley's understanding of who held power within it and on what terms. Sadie Pruitt was already seated in the witnesses' row along the wall, Ruth Colby beside her, back straight, hands folded. The posture of a woman who had spent 30 years in county proceedings and found nothing in this one that warranted a different bearing. Ruth gave Alma a single nod when their eyes met, the nod of a woman who has done her preparation and has nothing left to be uncertain about. Aldred entered with Greer at 5 minutes to 10 and sat at the opposing table with the assurance of a man who had already decided how this would end. Greer set a substantial stack of documents on the table, the thickness of which was itself a communication about the resources being deployed. Chairman Hayes called the session to order at precisely 10 o'clock. The formal opening identification of parties, statement of the matter, procedural notes took 9 minutes. When Hayes invited the submitting party to make an opening statement, Alma stood. She had not written one out. She knew this case well enough to say it plainly, and things said plainly in a room full of practical people landed more solidly than things read from a prepared text. Chairman Hayes, members of the board. Before we begin, I'm going to ask for something and I want to explain why. She reached into the submission folder and removed the 1,879 survey letter and set it on the table. This letter was commissioned by Clifton Aldred in 1,879 and addressed to him at Aldred Cattle Company. It concerns water resources in this valley and specifically references an unregistered spring source on my property. It carries 2 signatures, the lead surveyor and a witness. She looked at the board. The witness is Harold Hendricks. The room produced the specific silence of 40 people paying simultaneous complete attention. At the board table, Hendricks's hands moved from the table surface to his lap. A small movement. She registered it without looking directly at him. I'm requesting that Mr. Hendricks recuse himself from this hearing. He has a documented historical connection to the opposing party that was not disclosed. I'm not alleging current wrongdoing. I'm asking for the procedural integrity of this proceeding to be protected. Greer was on his feet before she finished. Swift, composed, technically sound. The witness signature established no conflict of interest, was not a professional or financial relationship, and raising it in this manner was theater designed to prejudice the board before evidence was considered. Hayes looked at Hendricks. Mr. Hendricks, do you wish to respond? Hendricks looked at the table surface for a moment that was 1 beat too long. I believe it would be appropriate for me to step back from this panel, he said, in the voice of a man who has run the available options and found this one least costly, in the interest of clarity. Greer sat down with the controlled movement of a lawyer filing an unexpected development under problems to manage rather than defeats to register. Hendricks gathered his notepad and moved to the observer's row. The 4 remaining board members repositioned, and Hayes confirmed that 4 members constituted a quorum. Aldred at his table was looking at the surface in front of him with the focused stillness of a man who has just registered that the proceeding is going to be more difficult than he was told. You may continue, Mrs. Rourke, Hayes said. She presented the case in the sequence they had built. The 1,863 survey first, its age-brown pages passed to each board member by Nessa, who moved along the board table with the composure of someone who had rehearsed the movement and saw no reason to add decoration to its execution. Ruth Colby was called as the first formal witness and identified the document, confirmed its provenance, and described its storage history with 30 years of professional precision, compressed into 8 minutes that left Greer no profitable angle of attack. He tried one anyway. Chain of custody, documents stored in a private residence post-retirement. Ruth Colby looked at him with the patience of a woman who had spent 3 decades dealing with procedural arguments considerably more sophisticated than this one. The document was transferred to my personal files when I retired, as was standard practice for clerks who had served as originating officer for the records in question. The county's retention protocol from that period did not cover privately commissioned surveys, and the document was safest in the custody of the person most familiar with its context. She folded her hands again. Would you like me to describe the county's 1860s records retention system in more detail, or may we proceed? Greer did not request more detail. The 1889 water assessment came next, with Ruth's departmental log entry, immediately following the contemporaneous written record of the misfiling instruction, dated and initialed in the ordinary course of her official duties at the moment the instruction was received. This was where Boone stood. He did not wait to be called. He rose from his chair with the specific, unhurried quality of a man who has decided what he is going to do and is not going to let the weight of it make him rush. He addressed the board before Greer could build a framework around the document. I served as county sheriff during the period when this filing instruction was processed. I approved the administrative categorization of this assessment in 1889 without reading its content with sufficient care. That was a failure of professional judgment, and I want to name it plainly in this room, before it's raised as a question about my credibility. The room was very still. I'm naming it, he continued, because the person who designed that filing instruction understood exactly what he was doing. He knew that an administrative step approved by a county officer would be far harder to question later than one that appeared to have slipped through unreviewed. The instruction was designed to look routine. I should have seen that it wasn't. He looked at Hayes without deflection. That failure made it easier for a document that belonged in public record to spend 35 years inaccessible to the property owner whose land it most directly concerned. I believe the board needs that context to evaluate the document and the circumstances of its suppression correctly. Hayes looked at Boone for a moment. Then the board accepts the context. Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. Greer raised 4 objections in sequence across the following 20 minutes. 2 were dismissed without extended deliberation. 1 generated a brief technical exchange between Hayes and Fenwick, who had engineering knowledge sufficient to evaluate the water assessment's methodology. That objection was set aside on the grounds that the 1889 assessment had been conducted by a certified county contractor, using methods consistent with the standards of its period. The 4th objection, that the 1879 letter constituted historical curiosity rather than evidence of intent, was the one Greer cared about. He argued it with more energy than the others, which was itself informative. Alma let him finish. Then she stood and read the relevant passage of the 1879 letter, aloud, the section identifying the unregistered spring source on Rourke land and recommending it be monitored for future development potential, and she did not editorialize. She did not need to. She let the date at the top of the letter do the work. 1879. 8 years before the drought that Aldred had used to justify closing the valve. 8 years before his lawyer had stood in front of her fence line and told her that the valve closure was a regrettable necessity of drought conservation. She set the letter down and looked at Hayes. The intent is in the date, she said simply. The room shifted. Not loudly. Just the collective adjustment of people who have heard something that reorganized the story they came in with. Then Sadie Pruitt stood. She had not been in Greer's preparation, which was evident in the specific quality of attention he gave her when Hayes called her name. She walked to the witness position with both hands at her sides. She had left her hat at her seat, and she said what she had come to say. Her father's name and his years of service and the nature of his records. The June 17th entry in his own hand. The margin notation, not broken, not scheduled, don't know why. Chester's account of the date he had heard discussed among the Aldred hands. Greer rose before she finished her account of Chester. This is double hearsay. The witness is repeating what her cousin told her he heard from unnamed. The journal entry is not hearsay. Alma was on her feet. It is a contemporaneous written record by the person who performed the act, in his own hand, at the time of the event. Sadie Pruitt's testimony authenticates the record. It does not substitute for it. Hayes looked at the journal. which had been passed forward as part of the submission. He looked at Greer. The written record speaks for itself. Authentication testimony is accepted. Objection denied. Aldred made a sound, then not a word, the involuntary release of a man whose expectation has just structurally failed. Small. Involuntary. Every person in that room heard it in the silence that had accumulated. He stood up. Greer put a hand on his arm. Aldred moved the arm away with a short, controlled motion that looked composed and was not. He addressed the room before his lawyer could organize an argument to offer on his behalf, and his voice, when he spoke, had the quality of a man who has decided that if the proceeding is going to go in this direction, he will attempt to direct it rather than be directed. That statement is a recollection of what this woman's deceased father may have said about an event that cannot now be. "Sit down, Mr. Aldred." Chairman Hayes's voice did not rise. It simply contained no give. "You are represented by counsel. Your counsel will address the board through proper procedure." Aldred looked at Hayes. He looked at the room, at the Valley residence in the rows of chairs, at Ruth Colby with her hands folded, at Sadie still standing with her chin level, at Nessa at the submission table with her journal and her complete composure. He looked at Boone Hartwell, sitting in his chair, with his arms resting on the table, looking back at Aldred with the uncomplicated attention of a man who has already said what he came to say and has nothing left to perform. Aldred sat down. The board deliberated for 1 hour and 53 minutes. They retired to the county building's back room, and the hearing room filled with the specific sound of a community managing uncertainty, low conversations, the creak of chairs, people who had arrived with a fixed expectation of the outcome no longer as fixed in it as they had been when the session opened. Alma sat at the submission table and did not move from it. Nessa brought water. Boone remained in his chair to her left and did not suggest that waiting was anything other than what it was, which was time that could not be shortened and therefore did not need to be resisted. At some point during the wait, she could not have said when exactly Boone's hand came to rest on the table beside hers. Not covering it. Not a gesture requiring acknowledgement. Simply present. The way a person communicated across the space between them, when words were not the right instrument and action was not yet the right instrument, and all that existed was the shared weight of waiting for something that mattered to both of them, for reasons that were partly the same and partly distinct and entirely real. She did not move her hand. Neither did he. At the opposing table, Aldred and Greer sat in close conversation that had the compressed quality of two people doing rapid damage assessment. She did not look at them because looking at them produced no useful information and cost the quality of fastidiousness she was committed to maintaining until there was cause to change it. Chairman Hayes returned to the room, and the silence that fell was the kind that only came when 60 people understood simultaneously that what came next could not be taken back. The room settled. Hayes looked at both tables, then at the room, then at his papers. The room came back to itself. Chairs scraped. Voices returned to normal register. People stood and turned to each other with the energy of an audience that has witnessed something they will describe for years. Old Pete Carvey was in the third row. When Alma's eyes found his across the room, he held her gaze without looking away, which was more than he had managed in 2 months. She let that be what it was, neither absolution nor condemnation. Just acknowledgement that the community had watched what it had watched and would carry it forward in whatever way communities carried things. She stood at the submission table until the room had mostly cleared. Then she picked up the organized folders, handed them to Nessa, and walked outside into the full sun of a Friday morning in Harding, Colorado, with the specific sensation of a woman who has set down something she has been carrying across a very long distance and whose body is still recalibrating to the new weight of itself. Aldred came through the door behind them 2 minutes later, with Greer moving fast and talking rapidly beside him. He walked to his horse at the rail and mounted and rode down the main street with his back straight and his chin level. And he did not look back at the county building or at the people on the boardwalk watching him go, and she understood from the quality of his departure that he understood exactly what had happened in that room and what it meant for the shape of his position in this valley going forward. She watched him ride out and felt none of the things she had anticipated feeling in this moment during the weeks of preparation. Not triumph. Not relief. Something more like the flat, clean recognition of a wrong returned to right, which was its own satisfaction, quieter than victory but more durable. Boone stood beside her. She had not watched him come to stand there. He was simply present, as he had been, in the place where presence was needed. She looked up at him in the sun. He looked back at her. And between them, in the particular quality of a Friday morning in August, with the hearing finished, and the valley laid out below, the ridge, and the water running at Rourke Hollow, under its own authority, something settled into its correct position, not loudly, not with declaration, just the final engagement of the latch that meant it would hold. Chairman Hayes walked back into the room the way men walked back into rooms when they had arrived at something they were prepared to stand behind. Not hurrying, not performing gravity, just the particular gait of a man who has made a decision in private and is now going to make it public, and who understands that the transition between those two states requires a certain quality of composure that cannot be borrowed from anyone else in the room. The 3 remaining board members filed in behind him, with the expressions of people who had argued something out to its conclusion and were done with the arguing. Alma watched Hayes cross to his chair and settle into it, and arrange the papers in front of him with unhurried hands, and she made herself breathe at a normal pace while he did it, which required actual effort. The room, which had been managing its 60-odd occupants with the low continuous sound of contained uncertainty, went quiet without anyone asking it to. That particular silence, the kind that drops over a room the moment the decision-maker sits down, was one of the most absolute forms of quiet Alma had ever known. Heavier than the quiet of an empty house. Heavier than the quiet of land in drought. It had the weight of a thing about to become permanent. Hayes looked at both tables. He looked at the room. He straightened the papers once more, which was not a nervous gesture but a final organizational one. The habit of a man who did things in correct sequence regardless of the audience. The board has reviewed the submitted evidence in its entirety, he said. We've examined the 1,863 property survey, the 1,889 water assessment, and the departmental log entry pertaining to its filing, the 1,879 survey correspondence addressed to Mr. Aldred, the signed witness statement of Sadie Pruitt with the accompanying maintenance record, and the chronological summary document prepared by the submitting party. He paused. We have also reviewed the objections raised by counsel for Mr. Aldred and assessed each on its procedural and substantive merits. Greer had his pen in his hand and was writing something on the top sheet of his document stack, which was the move of a lawyer preparing to respond to whatever came next regardless of what it was. The board finds as follows. Hayes looked at the papers in front of him, but his voice had the quality of a man reciting from memory rather than reading the words sitting in him before they were on the page. The spring source located at the northeast boundary of Rourke Hollow, as identified in the 1,863 property survey commissioned by Silas Rourke and corroborated by the 1,889 county water assessment, is recognized as a natural water resource existing wholly within the legal boundaries of Rourke Hollow. The aquifer feeding this source is geologically distinct from the shared channel system serving multiple properties in this valley, and no claim of shared resource designation applies to it. Greer's pen stopped moving. On the matter of the shared irrigation valve, the board finds that the closure of the valve on June 17th of this year, as documented in the maintenance record submitted by Sadie Pruitt and corroborated by testimony as to the date, preceded the county conservation order issued July 9th by a period of 3 weeks. This closure therefore was not performed in compliance with drought emergency protocol and did not have county authorization at the time it was executed. Hayes looked up from the paper. The board is ordering the immediate and unconditional restoration of Mrs. Rourke's access to the shared irrigation channel at the pre-existing flow rate, effective within 48 hours of this ruling. The room moved. Not sound exactly more a physical shift, the collective adjustment of 60 bodies responding to something that had resolved. Alma felt it against her skin the way you felt a change in wind direction before you heard it in the trees. Additionally, Hayes continued, and the word carried enough weight that the room resettled into its silence to receive what came next. The board is entering a formal notation into Harding County's permanent water rights record regarding the manipulation of a legally shared water resource by an adjacent property owner. This notation will detail the specific conduct identified in this proceeding and will be accessible to any party conducting future water rights research in this county. He set the papers down and looked at Aldred directly for the first time since returning to the room. Mr. Aldred. This board does not have criminal jurisdiction. But we have the authority to make this record, and we are making it. Clifton Aldred sat at his table in his charcoal suit and did not say anything. He did not move. He was looking at the surface of the table in front of him with the expression of a man who has just encountered the specific limit of what money and patience and careful planning can protect against, which is the truth, fully assembled, presented in an official room to an official body by people who had nothing to lose except the thing that mattered most to them, and had decided that was sufficient reason to tell it. Greer put his hand on Aldred's arm. This time Aldred did not move the arm away. He just sat. Hayes declared the session closed. The room came back to itself in the way rooms did after proceedings ended, the scrape of chairs, the sound of voices returning to normal register, people standing and turning to each other, with the particular energy of an audience that had watched something they would describe to other people for years. Ruth Colby stood from the witnesses' row and smoothed her dress with both hands and did not look at anyone specifically, which was the comportment of a woman who considered her work here complete and was not in search of acknowledgement for it. Sadie Pruitt was still in her seat, hands in her lap, and when Alma caught her eye across the room, Sadie gave a single nod, small, final, the gesture of a woman who had said the thing that needed saying and had arrived on the other side of it. Alma stood at the submission table and did not immediately move. She had prepared carefully for the hearing itself. She had not, she realized, fully prepared for the moment after it. The specific quality of the room had changed the pressure that had been building since June 17th had released, and the absence of it was its own kind of sensation, unfamiliar in a way that took a moment to identify. What she felt was not elation, which surprised her until it didn't. Elation was for things you hadn't been certain you could earn. This felt more like the moment when you set down something you have been carrying for a long distance, and your body has to recalibrate to the new weight of itself. Boone was standing beside her. She had not watched him stand, he was simply there, as he had been for the preceding weeks, in the specific place where presence was needed without requiring announcement. "Come outside," he said quietly. They left the submission documents in Nessa's care, which was the correct place to leave them. Nessa was already stacking the folders in their proper order, returning each document to its sleeve, prepared to carry the organized case materials back to Rourke Hollow with the same composure she had carried them out with. She did not look up as they left, but her posture had the settled quality of a person who had tracked the outcome she expected and was now completing the process correctly. The street outside the county building was in direct sun. After the close air of the hearing room, the brightness was stark. A group of Valley residents had gathered near the feed store, across the way people who hadn't been able to get inside, who had waited in the street for the outcome to emerge. They turned when Alma and Boone came through the door, and there was a moment of community appraisal, the silent assessment of a group of people reading a face to determine what the face was carrying. Old Pete Carvey was in the group, the man who had stopped returning her signals at the road crossing, who had removed himself from her vicinity when Aldred's gravity became too strong to resist. He looked at her across the street with the expression of a man who knows he has been a coward in a small way and is not going to pretend otherwise. She did not smile at him, and she did not cut him either. She simply met his eyes and let that be what it was. Aldred came through the door behind them a few minutes later, with Greer moving fast beside him, talking rapidly in the low, urgent way of a lawyer who is already managing the next problem. Aldred walked past Alma without looking at her. He walked past Boone without looking at him. He walked to his horse at the rail with the controlled movement of a man directing every available resource toward maintaining his external composure, and he mounted and rode down the main street of Harding, with his back straight and his chin level, and he did not look back. She watched him go, not with satisfaction, not with relief, not with any of the things she had imagined feeling in this moment during the long weeks of preparation. What she actually felt, watching Clifton Aldred ride away from the thing he had spent 8 years engineering and had just lost in a county hearing room before an audience of his neighbors, was something closer to recognition. He had built a plan on the assumption that time and resources and a careful arrangement of obstacles would eventually reduce her to a point where she would give up. And the thing he had not factored into the plan, because it was the kind of thing that didn't appear in surveys or financial assessments or legal filings, was that she had Silas Rourke's blood and Silas Rourke's land, and the same quality of attention that had caused an old man to stand on a piece of ground in 1000 863 and understand what was under it, and spend the rest of his capable years making sure it would still be there for whoever came after. Some things did not show up in a man's accounting, and those were precisely the things that determined outcomes. She turned away from the street and found Boone watching her. "Let's go home," she said. The ride back to Rourke Hollow was different from the morning ride in every way that a ride across the same road could be different. The same road, the same horses, the same Colorado sky, going toward the full heat of late morning. But the pressure that had structured every mile of every day since June 17th was absent, and its absence changed the quality of the air around her. She rode without the forward-leaning urgency that had become her default posture, and let the bay mare set her own comfortable pace, and felt the specific freedom of a body that has been allowed to stop bracing. Nessa rode slightly behind, and to the right, which was unusual. She typically rode with her mother rather than behind her. But she had positioned herself at a different angle from the road, and Alma understood without needing to confirm it that this was intentional. Nessa was giving them the road. Boone rode beside Alma, where the road was wide enough, which it was for most of the way back. They did not talk much. He said at one point that he thought Hayes had been prepared to rule that way before the deliberation started, and that the hour and 50 minutes had been the board working through the form of the decision rather than the substance of it, and Alma said she thought he was probably right. They rode the dry creek bed crossing where the bay mare picked her way across the pale stones, and the crossing felt different from every other time she had made it that season, because every other time she had crossed it, she had been carrying something that she was not carrying now. Ruth Colby's documents would be returned to their respective custodians that afternoon. Sadie Pruitt's journal would go back to Sadie today, as promised, with a note from Alma that said things that needed saying about Robert Pruitt and his careful handwriting and the margin notation that had counted for something after all. The submission folder would be stored in Alma's document box alongside the property deed and Thomas's death certificate and the paid-off banknote that had been the hardest single thing she had managed since the drought started, accomplished 6 weeks ago at a cost she had not shared with anyone because there was no purpose in sharing it. That afternoon she found Boone at the spring. He had walked over from his property through the gap in the north fence that they had stopped repairing as a practical acknowledgement that the traffic between the two properties had become too frequent for the fence to serve its original function. He was standing at the edge of the stone channel with his hat in his hand, watching the water move through the channel toward the trough, and his expression was the one she had seen on him occasionally, the interior one, the one where he was not presenting anything to anyone, but was simply in the experience of a moment without managing it. She stood beside him. The water moved. The cattle were at the trough in the unhurried way they drank when they trusted the supply. None of the anxious crowding of the dry weeks, none of the competition for position. Just the steady, self-assured consumption of animals that had recalibrated to abundance. Hennessy did good work, Boone said about the pump. He did. She watched the water. I paid the invoice this morning before we went to the hearing. I wanted it settled. Of course you did. He said it with the specific note of someone who had learned her well enough to predict her and was not surprised to be right. A pause. What happens to the note on the property now? With the water secured, the bank will see a different risk profile on the next review. She had thought about this. The loan that had been threatening to become unmanageable in the absence of a viable water source was still the same loan, but a ranch with a secured independent water supply and a county water rights ruling in its favor was a different kind of collateral than a drought-stressed operation with a contested water situation. Gerald Foss is a practical man. He'll recognize the difference. He will. Another pause. And the shared channel is open again as of tomorrow morning. Aldred will honor the order, she said. Whatever else he is, he understands that defying an official county ruling in the current climate would cost him more than he could recover from in this valley. He'll comply. She had thought about the future of that relationship, the ongoing fact of Clifton Aldred as a neighbor, as the operator of the largest property bordering hers, as the man who had spent 8 years planning to take what was hers. She had thought about it without resolution, because resolution was not available from one direction alone. What she had determined was that she would not make any decision about that relationship from a position of victory, because decisions made from victory had a way of being ungracious in ways that created new problems, and she was too tired for new problems. What she would do was the practical thing, which was to continue to be exactly the kind of neighbor she had always been: reliable, clear in her terms, not given to either excessive warmth or unnecessary coldness, and to let the county water rights record say what it needed to say without her adding commentary. Boone was looking at her. She could feel it without turning. "There's something I've been not saying," he said. She turned. He was holding his hat in both hands in front of him, not the nervous gesture of someone uncertain, more the deliberate handling of an object while you attended to something else entirely. He was looking at her with the expression that had been developing for weeks, and that she had been tracking without naming. The way you track weather coming from a distance before you decide to name it as anything in particular. "I know the timing," he said. "I know today is not the day for a complicated conversation. I know you just came through something that required everything you had for the better part of 2 months, and that what a person needs after that is not another thing requiring everything they have." He paused. "So I'm not going to make this complicated. I'm going to say the simple version, and you can do whatever you want with it." She waited. "I would like to stay," he said. "Not just on the Hartwell property. I mean here. In whatever arrangement makes sense given two people who have different properties and similar histories, and have apparently become necessary to each other without either of us planning for it." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking you for an answer today. I'm asking you to know that the question exists." She thought about the specific geography of what he was describing: 2 properties that had already begun to function as one in practical terms. Separated by a fence gap they had both stopped repairing. 2 people who had worked the same table, ridden the same roads, sat on the same porch in the dark and traded the weight of their histories, without either of them performing anything about it. She thought about what Thomas would have made of Boone Hartwell, and the answer came without effort. Thomas would have liked him immediately, trusted him within a season, and probably borrowed his post driver on a regular basis and returned it slightly later than promised. She thought about what it meant to be asked by a man who understood how to ask a thing without making the asking into a pressure, who could say "I would like to stay," and then follow it with "I'm not asking you for an answer today," and mean both parts simultaneously, without one undermining the other. "I know the question exists," she said. "I've known it for a while." He looked at her. And I need another season," she said. "Not because I'm uncertain. Because I've spent 4 years doing things on a deadline, and I'd like to make at least one significant decision without one." Something moved across his face, not disappointment, more like the recognition of an answer that was exactly what he should have expected from this particular woman, and the acknowledgement that expecting anything else would have been a failure of his attention. "That's reasonable," he said. "A season is reasonable. It might be less than a season." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on. "I'll be across the north fence," he said, "in whatever direction that matters." She watched him walk back through the gap in the fence toward the Hartwell property, his large frame moving with the unhurried economy that was his natural mode, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time that was not urgency and not resolve, and not the forward-leaning determination that had carried her through the preceding months. It was something quieter. The specific sensation of a future that had more than one possible shape, and of herself standing at the beginning of it with the ability to choose between them. The season turned. Not all at once, it never did. But by degrees the brutal heat of that August gave way to the cooler air of September, and September brought rain that came in earnest rather than the teasing partial showers of the drought months, and the valley responded with the specific gratitude of land that has been thirsty for a very long time. The creek beds began to run again. The pastures put out new growth, thin at first, then with more conviction as the rainfall accumulated. At Rourke Hollow, the spring ran through all of its steady, indifferent to drought or rain, governed by its own internal supply that did not depend on surface conditions. Hennessy's casing held perfectly. The hand pump worked every morning that Alma operated it, and the trough stayed full, and the cattle recovered their body weight with the systematic efficiency of animals allowed to eat and drink at a pace that matched their need. The shared irrigation channel was restored within 48 hours of the ruling, as she had predicted. A man she didn't recognize came out from the Aldred operation and opened the valve without speaking to anyone on the Rourke side of the fence line, and the water came through and ran down the irrigation ditch, and Alma stood at the end of it and watched it arrive and felt the specific emotion of a thing restored, that should never have been taken, not gratitude, which implied the restoration was a gift, but the flat, clean recognition of a wrong returned to right. Nessa started something new in October. Not observation columns, she had been doing those without interruption, but a different project. A formal, written account of the valley's water sources, assembled from her summer's records, and Ruth Colby's documents and Hennessy's installation data, and the county board's ruling. She said she thought other small operations in the valley might have similar resources on their land that they didn't know about. Would you treat them with kindness? And that a systematic account of what to look for and where to look might prevent the next version of what had happened to Rourke Hollow from happening to someone else who didn't have the luck of a careful great-grandfather and a daughter who paid attention to the temperature of soil. She read Alma the first 3 pages on a Tuesday evening in October. They were good. They were clear and specific and grounded in evidence, and they had the quality of writing produced by a person who had learned that the best description of a complicated thing was usually the most accurate one, and not the most elaborate. You should send it to the County Agricultural Extension Office, Alma said. When it's finished. I know, Nessa said, I'm going to. She said it with the particular confidence of a young woman who had spent a summer doing serious work alongside serious people, and had arrived on the other side of it understanding what she was capable of, which was considerable, and which she was now in the process of figuring out how to apply at a scale beyond the immediate boundaries of the family property. Alma looked at her daughter across the kitchen table and felt the complicated love of a parent who recognizes that the person across from them is on their way to something that will take them farther than the place they started from, and who understands that this is the right outcome and the difficult one simultaneously. The formal notation in Harding County's water rights record regarding Clifton Aldred's conduct was entered the 3rd week of September. She saw the receipt of filing in her paperwork from the county and held it for a moment before adding it to the document box. She did not feel the need to tell anyone about it. It was in the record. That was what mattered. Aldred himself was a presence in the valley. As he had always been, the Aldred Cattle Company did not dissolve, and its operations continued at their scale. But the specific quality of his presence changed in the way that power changed, when its mechanism was made visible to the community it operated within. He was still the largest landowner in Harding Valley. He was no longer the man whose influence moved through the community unquestioned because no one had reason to question it. The distinction was not dramatic from the outside. It was significant from the inside, in the daily texture of interactions, in who looked directly at whom when they passed in town, in the specific conversational quality of a community that had seen something named clearly and found it had been waiting to name it. Old Pete Carvey came by Rourke Hollow on a Thursday in late September, with a covered dish that his wife had sent, and with the expression of a man executing an apology that he had been putting off for 6 weeks. He said nothing about why he had pulled back during the worst of the summer. He didn't need to. She accepted the dish and invited him to sit on the porch for 20 minutes, and they talked about the rain and the pasture recovery, and whether the creek would be fully running by winter, and when he left his posture was lighter than when he arrived, which was the point. The October morning that Boone came to the south side of the property, not through the north fence gap but around the long way, which meant he had ridden out from his own gate and come up the Rourke Drive properly, he was carrying something wrapped in cloth. He knocked at the kitchen door, which he had not done in weeks. She opened it and looked at what he was holding. A clock, small, made of dark walnut, with a dial face of cream-colored enamel and hands that were clearly functional rather than decorative. Not new, the case had the wear of something that had been kept in a household for years. Not Thomas's style, and not a replacement for the watch in any direct sense. Something else entirely. It was Margaret's, he said. She bought it at a market in Pueblo before we moved here. It kept good time. I haven't had it out of the box since she died because I didn't have a reason to. He held it out. She looked at him across it, at this large, careful man standing at her kitchen door in October light with a clock in his hands that had belonged to his wife, offering it not as a replacement for what she had lost but as its own thing, its own history, its own small, steady measure of time moving forward. She took it from him with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. "Come in," she said. "The coffee is on." He came in. He sat at the table. She set the clock on the sideboard where it could be seen from the kitchen table, and she wound it the way he showed her, and set the hands to the correct time. and it ticked in the kitchen with the quiet regularity of something that had been waiting to be useful again, and was now being useful again. They drank coffee and talked about the north pasture recovery and the cattle weights, and a drainage problem along the west fence line that was going to need attention before the real rains came. Practical things. The things that a working life was made of, the substance beneath the events, the ordinary ongoing texture of two people who had decided without quite saying so that the ordinary ongoing texture of their lives would be shared. The first snow came in November. Light, the kind that made the valley look like it had been remade overnight, every surface covered in the specific clean white that preceded the harder winter to come. She stood at the kitchen window in the early morning and looked at the windmill foundation visible from the house, its stone walls holding the snow in their hollows, the pipe of the hand pump rising from the center, with a slight steam coming off the pump housing from the ground warmth below. The spring underneath it, which did not know about seasons in the way the surface world knew about them, moved steadily as it had always moved, governed by its own deeper logic. She was standing there when Nessa came downstairs, already dressed for outdoor work, and stood beside her at the window. They looked at it together, the white pasture, the stone foundation, the quiet evidence of water that had been there all along. "Do you think Silas knew someone would find it?" Nessa asked. Alma thought about a man in 1863, standing on this ground in a dry year, looking at a piece of earth that was cooler than its neighbors and understanding what that meant. Building a spring house and capping it and fitting the stones with care, and walking away, without telling anyone exactly what he'd done or why, leaving only the stones and the sealed cap and the windmill foundation as markers for someone who came later with enough attention to read them. "I think he knew someone should find it," she said. "He just didn't know who." Nessa looked at the spring house for another moment. "I'm glad it was us." "So am I." Alma turned from the window. She had cattle to check, a fence line to inspect before the ground froze solid, and a letter to write to the county agricultural extension office, because Nessa's account of the valley's water resources was finished, and it was Alma's intention to see it delivered to the right person before the end of the month. "Put your coat on." "The east pasture first." Nessa put her coat on heavy wool, the dark green one she'd made over from a coat of Thomas's that was too good to waste, and they went out together into the new snow, boots marking the first tracks across the white yard, the cold air sharp and clean, in a way that Colorado mornings in November were specifically good at. Boone was coming across the north pasture through the snow, his large frame moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that haste and cold ground were a poor combination. He was carrying a length of fence wire and a post driver, which meant he had already identified which part of the shared fence line needed attention and had organized himself to address it before she had to ask. She watched him come across the white field, the snow around him, the fence wire in his hand. The particular quality of a man who showed up when showing up was what was needed, without requiring the occasion to be announced. Some things, she thought, you did not figure out by thinking. You figured them out by watching, by paying attention long enough to understand what you were actually looking at, rather than what you had expected to see when you started looking. Silas Rourke had known that. He had passed it down through the land itself, which was the only language he had available that lasted. She had learned it from the ground of Rourke Hollow in the worst summer she had lived through, and she would pass it to Nessa in the only way it could be passed, by doing it, every day, in front of someone who was watching. Boone reached the fence gap and came through it, and looked at her across the snowy yard. "East pasture fence?" he asked. "East pasture fence," she confirmed. They went. In April, 6 months after their October wedding, when the snow was fully gone and the pastures had put out the specific vivid green that followed a good winter's moisture, Alma stood at the spring with both hands resting below her ribs, in the unconscious posture of a woman who has just understood something about herself that she is still deciding how to carry. She had known for 3 weeks. She had not told anyone, which was not avoidance but the hoarding of a thing she needed to hold privately for a specific period before it became shared. The same way the ground had held the spring privately for generations before the right moment arrived to open it. Nessa came up beside her from the direction of the windmill. She had been checking the pump housing for frost damage, which was a morning habit she had maintained since November. She looked at her mother. She looked at Alma's hands. She was, as she had always been, paying attention. "Mom." Alma looked at her daughter. "Tell him today," Nessa said. She did not ask how Nessa knew. The answer to that question was the same answer to every question about Nessa. She was paying attention. She had always been paying attention. I was going to tell him this evening, Alma said. Tell him today. Nessa went back to the pump housing with her screwdriver and her journal, and the conversation was complete, which was how conversations with Nessa typically ended at exactly the right point and not one word past it. Alma stood at the spring for another moment. The water moved under the pump housing, steady and cold, governed by the same deep source that had been there since before Silas, before the valley was settled, before any person had thought to put a claim on the ground above it. She had spent 14 months fighting for the right to stand here, on this specific ground, with her hands on the pump handle, and she had won that fight by the accumulation of careful work and the specific courage of people who did the right thing when the right thing was available to them. She went to find Boone. He was at the north fence line, not because anything needed repair. The fence was in good condition after the winter work, but because he made a habit of walking the perimeter in the morning, which was the habit of a man who understood that attention was what kept things from failing, and that the time to find a problem was before it became one. She saw him from 100 yards out, his broad back to her, as he checked the tension on a wire run, unhurried, thorough. She walked across the pasture in the April sun. He turned before she was fully to him. He had learned the sound of her approach the way she had learned his, the specific footfall of someone familiar enough to recognize before you saw them. He looked at her face, and whatever he read there stopped him from saying anything immediately, which was exactly right. She told him. For a moment he was very still, the fence wire in his hand, the April morning around them, the valley below and the ridge above, and somewhere behind them, the sound of water moving through stone on its way to the trough. Then he set the fence wire down on the post and walked the 3 steps between them and put his arms around her, which was the first time in the entire preceding year that he had held her rather than stood beside her, and the distinction was everything: the warmth and the specific solidity of it, the fact of being held by someone large enough that she had to make no adjustment to how she stood, could simply be her full size inside someone else's. She let herself be held. For 1 complete minute, without checking anything, or planning anything, or attending to any of the 100 things that the morning and the day and the season ahead would require her to attend to. 1 minute of being simply present in a moment that was, without qualification, good. Then she stepped back and looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before in its complete form, the expression a person wore when they had not expected to have something returned to them that they had closed the accounting on, and the return of it was arriving in a form they could not have designed, but that was precisely right anyway. His eyes were bright in a way he was not hiding. "I promised you a season," she said. "You did." His voice had a roughness to it. "I was prepared to wait longer." "I know you were." She looked at him. "That's one of the reasons you didn't have to." They walked back across the pasture together in the April sun, the man and the woman and the land and the water under it, and the morning ahead of them that was nothing more and nothing less than a morning on a working ranch in Harding Valley, Colorado, which was all it had ever needed to be. The windmill turned in the light breeze above the spring house. The water moved through the stone channel. The cattle drank at the trough without crowding, without urgency, in the manner of animals that had learned to trust the supply. And the land, which had held its secret for generations, and then given it up to the right hands at the right time, continued to do what land did when it was properly tended. It held everything placed in its care, and it gave back, steadily, exactly what it had been given.